The story I am going to tell moves like a train leaving a station at dawn, engines clattering against the rails, carrying a cargo of ambitions that will reshape a continent. It begins not with a single thunderclap but with a long season of small decisions, of treaties and tariffs, of quiet conversations and smoke-filled rooms where maps were traced and futures imagined. The years after Napoleon's fall left Central Europe fragmented and raw, a landscape of principalities and kingdoms connected by language and history but divided by law and custom. That division was the first thing the leaders of the 19th century set out to correct, and their efforts would gather force until they could not be stopped. History doesn't begin with a bang, it starts with people daring to plan. Subscribe and share in the comments what speaks to you more, the quiet choices that build change or the unstoppable rush once it begins. Look at the map of German-speaking lands in the decades before unification and you see a mosaic of states, tiny duchies, free cities with proud charters, kingdoms that ruled over huge territories. Each of these governments had its own ruler, its own army, and often its own tariff barriers that made trade slow and expensive. Yet beneath the legal and political divisions there was a cultural unity that no border could entirely erase, the language, literature, religious patterns, and memory of shared conflicts and alliances knit people together. This slow, underlying unity mattered because politics often finds its footing where people already feel a sense of belonging. Prussia, in the northeast, rose slowly from this tapestry as both a military power and an administrative model. Its rulers, especially after the trauma of Napoleon, set about modernizing the state with a relentless attention to detail. They reformed the army, created a disciplined bureaucracy, and embraced industrial innovations that changed the nature of warfare and production. The iron rails and the factories that sprouted in Prussian lands were not merely economic assets, they were the skeleton of the modern state, giving it mobility, wealth, and an ability to project power. When Otto von Bismarck arrived on the scene, he brought with him a temperament that mixed cold calculation with a willingness to use force when necessary. He was, in a way, the interpreter of Prussia's strengths to the rest of Germany, able to translate military might into political outcomes. Bismarck did not pretend to be a democrat. He distrusted mass movements and preferred the authority of monarchs and the discipline of armies. Yet he understood public opinion and parliamentary life well enough to manipulate them when it served his larger purposes. The famous phrase that has come to stand for Bismarck's approach, blood and iron, was not a promise of endless war but an argument about the methods needed to settle the great questions of the day. In 1862, he told the Parliamentary Assembly that the future of the nation would be determined not by speeches and majorities, but by blood and iron. He meant that diplomacy would have to be backed by military preparedness, that the threats and realities of force would shape political outcomes. The image of iron, for industry, railways, and weapons, paired with blood, for sacrifice and conflict, captures the brutal arithmetic of power in that era. But Bismarck's strategy was not mindless aggression. He was an operator of systems. He sought to combine wars that were limited and decisive with diplomatic maneuvers that isolated enemies and brought allies into line. He believed in staging conflicts that would strengthen Prussia while leaving the new order intact and controllable. This required meticulous planning and an awareness of timing. Wars would be used when they could produce a quick, favorable result and when they could be justified to other German states. The first major test of Bismarck's plan came with the Danish War of 1864. The dispute over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein might look provincial to a modern ear, but it provided the perfect stage for Prussia to demonstrate its military and diplomatic readiness. Prussia and Austria fought side by side against Denmark, and the victory reorganized control of those territories. Yet the alliance with Austria was uneasy and temporary. Having collaborated to win the duchies, Prussia and Austria soon found themselves pulling in different directions. That war left a complicated inheritance. Prussia had taken a step toward leadership in German affairs, but Austria remained a dominant force in German-speaking Europe and a rival in every important sense. The two powers had to find a way to settle the competition or face recurring conflict. For Bismarck, the choice was clear: weaken Austria's influence in the German sphere without provoking a coalition of other great powers against Prussia. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 would be the test of whether he could orchestrate such an outcome. When the conflict came, it was swift and decisive. Prussia's army, reformed and equipped with new weapons and supported by a growing rail network, moved with a tempo that Austrian forces could not match. The Battle of Königgrätz, Sadowa, as some call it, was the climactic moment where Prussian organization and technology met the old-style Austrian system and came out victorious. The result was not merely a military victory, it was a profound shift in the balance of power among German states. After 1866, the map of Germany began to redraw itself. Bismarck created the North German Confederation, a political structure that bound together the northern states under Prussian leadership while leaving the southern kingdoms more loosely tied. It was a clever compromise. Prussia could expand its authority without directly annihilating the identities of other states that might then stir resentment. The Confederation also established precedents, federal institutions, and military arrangements that made the eventual leap to full unification easier. The economic underpinnings of this new order mattered as much as battles did. The Zollverein, a customs union led by Prussia, had already knitted many German states together economically by removing internal tariffs and creating a common market. This integration allowed industrial production to scale, encouraged specialization, and made the region more interdependent. Iron and coal flows mapped onto political power, and factories and rail lines became the arteries through which Prussia's influence traveled. Industry didn't just bring wealth, it changed social relations and politics. Cities filled with workers who had different expectations than rural peasants. New communications, newspapers, and associations spread ideas and created a public sphere in which national debates could be held. Bismarck, ever the realist, saw both opportunity and danger in these changes. He knew that nationalism could be harnessed, but that social unrest could also threaten the order he wanted to preserve. In this charged environment, the opportunity for the final act arrived with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. Diplomacy, rumor, and a manufactured crisis combined to provoke France and Prussia into conflict. Bismarck's handling of an altered message from a diplomatic exchange inflamed French pride and made war seem inevitable. For many in the French government, war appeared a means to punish Prussia and prevent its rising dominance. For Bismarck, it was a chance to complete unification on terms most favorable to Prussia. The war itself revealed how thoroughly Prussia had prepared. Its general staff, centralized command, and use of railways allowed it to mobilize and concentrate forces swiftly, while new breech-loading rifles and artillery gave its troops tactical advantages. The German states rallied to Prussia's banner as promised, and the southern kingdoms joined the cause against France. Each victory on the field added momentum to the idea that a unified German nation was not only militarily feasible but politically desirable. When Paris finally fell and the French Empire crumbled, the moment for proclamation arrived. It happened not in Berlin, not in the halls of a German parliament, but in the mirrored splendor of the Palace of Versailles, in the iron and shadow of a French throne room. Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor in January 1871, an act at once symbolic and practical. The new empire's very birth in Versailles announced a political order now led by Prussia and validated by the collapse of a once dominant neighbor. The image of the emperor under the vaulted ceilings, surrounded by princes and generals, became the emblem of the new state. It signified a German nation-state rooted in monarchical authority but built from the collective will of many separate entities. This union, forged in war as much as in negotiation, carried the imprint of its origins, a state created by forceful diplomacy and decisive military action, a political reality that combined federal structures with a dominant central power. Once the German Empire was proclaimed, the work of consolidating power and constructing institutions began. A constitution would establish the formal structures of governance, a parliament would meet and argue, and a chancellor, Bismarck himself, would hold a central and powerful office. But the new empire was not a liberal state in the Anglo-American sense. It kept strong monarchical features and a political culture that prized order and hierarchy. The tension between monarchical authority and emergent popular forces would define much of the decades that followed. Bismarck's domestic policies were guided by the same pragmatic realism that had shaped his wars. He aimed to stabilize the empire, to reduce the power of rival centers, and to preempt social forces that could threaten the monarchy. His measures often combined carrots and sticks. Repressive moves against perceived threats were matched by reforms designed to undercut revolutionary appeal. In this way, he tried to secure the new order not only by law but by shaping the conditions of social life. One of the major domestic contests was the Kulturkampf, a struggle between the imperial government and the Catholic Church. Bismarck feared that the Church's loyalty to Rome could undermine the unity and authority of the state, particularly in regions with strong Catholic populations. He implemented laws that placed the education of priests and the appointment of clergy under state influence, sought to limit church courts, and required civil marriage. The campaign had mixed results. It provoked resistance and ultimately was tempered by Bismarck when political realities changed. Yet it illustrated the empire's willingness to subordinate traditional institutions to national cohesion. At the same time, Bismarck turned his attention to the rising socialist movement, which drew support from the industrial working class. Rather than simply imprisoning or expelling socialists, he enacted the anti-socialist laws to suppress their organizations and publications while simultaneously introducing social legislation to blunt their appeal. He sponsored old age pensions, accident insurance, and health insurance, measures that were revolutionary in scope and designed to create loyalty among workers. It was a shrewd mixture of repression and social investment intended to integrate the working class into the imperial project. This social legislation had long-term significance beyond immediate politics. It signaled a transformation in the relationship between state and citizen in which the state claimed responsibility for certain social risks. The move also reflected broader European trends, but in Germany it carried the additional weight of consolidating a new political community that spanned diverse regions. Workers who might once have directed their anger at local authorities now had incentives to accept the state as a protector and employer of last resort. Economically, the German Empire quickly became a powerhouse. Industrialization accelerated, and the production of steel, chemicals, and precision machinery rose to levels that would make Germany a leader in several key sectors. Scientific education and technical training produced engineers and chemists whose innovations found immediate application in industry. Banking and business structures developed in ways that linked capital to enterprise across the nation, enabling large-scale projects and making possible the mammoth industrial combines that would later define modern capitalism. The rail network, so crucial in wartime, continued to knit the empire together in peacetime. Railways reduced the cost of moving goods and people, integrated markets, and made possible the efficient distribution of raw materials and finished products. Towns that had once been provincial centers became nodes in a national economy. The physical connectivity of Germany helped foster a shared sense of destiny, though it also created disparities as certain regions industrialized rapidly while others remained agricultural and less prosperous. Culturally, the new empire fostered a narrative of German greatness that drew on history, music, philosophy, and science. Schools and universities were sites where a national curriculum and scholarly networks produced a shared elite culture. Literature and the arts reflected themes of pride, loss, and aspiration, and public festivals and monuments gave visible form to national memory. Yet beneath the unified rhetoric of culture there were ongoing tensions, regional identities persisted, religious divides endured, and class differences became increasingly pronounced. In foreign policy, Bismarck sought stability by balancing power through a complex web of alliances and understandings. He did not want to leave Germany vulnerable to encirclement or to see a Europe reshaped by sudden revolutionary impulses. His diplomacy aimed to isolate France, maintain friendly relations with Russia and Austria where possible, and keep Britain at a diplomatic distance but not as an enemy. The result was a series of treaties and alignments designed to preserve the peace in a way that favored Germany's strategic position. One of Bismarck's most intriguing qualities was his adaptability. He could be ruthless in one moment and conciliatory in the next, altering policies when the balance of power shifted. He recognized when the Kulturkampf had run its course and moderated it. He changed tactics on the social question as the SPD, Social Democratic Party, grew in strength through electoral politics rather than street revolution. This political flexibility helped the empire survive immediate crises and extended its stability for decades. Still, the internal contradictions of the empire were never fully resolved. The Constitution left considerable discretionary power in the hands of the emperor and the chancellor, while the Reichstag, the parliament, had limited influence over the government. This hybrid arrangement created space for conflict as different groups pushed for more representation, more rights, or more influence over policy. Political culture oscillated between deference to authority and demands for participation, and the tension often found expression in fervent debates and electoral contests. The southern German states, with their Catholic majorities and distinct traditions, remained somewhat ambivalent about the new order. They had accepted the imperial structure largely because of the common cause against France and because of the guarantees of local autonomy. Over time, however, the economic and military incentives of membership and the integration of elites into imperial institutions reduced resistance. It was a process of accommodation rather than homogenization. Local customs and identities continued to matter even within the broader national framework. Internationally, the existence of a powerful Germany altered calculations across Europe. Diplomats and statesmen had to reckon with a nation that combined industrial might, military efficiency, and a strategic location at the center of the continent. Colonial ambitions, too, began to stir in the imperial imagination, though Germany was later to come to overseas expansion with less time and fewer bases than rival powers. The scramble for colonies reflected not only economic interest but also prestige and the norms of great power status. Military culture remained central to the empire. Officer corps, regimental pride, and the glorification of battlefield virtues continued to shape German political life. Military service was a common experience for many young men and formed a kind of civic baptism that reinforced loyalty to the state. The Army's role as a stabilizing institution made it both a symbol and an instrument of unity, yet its preeminence also contributed to the militarized mood that would later have dangerous consequences. Education and pedagogy were reorganized to cultivate citizens fit for the new state. Compulsory schooling spread, and curricula emphasized history, language, and civic duty. Universities flourished as centers of research, and German scholarship in fields from physics to philology gained international recognition. This intellectual vitality reinforced national pride and created a reservoir of expertise upon which industry and government could draw. Yet the empire's achievements coexisted with persistent inequalities. Rural poverty, urban slums, and the plight of migrant laborers were realities that modernization did not erase. Industrial growth produced wealth but also harsh working conditions and social dislocation. The state tried to mitigate these problems with social insurance, but the solutions were imperfect and often aimed at stabilizing political order rather than eliminating structural injustice. Political parties multiplied and parliamentary life became a central arena of contest. Conservatives, liberals, centrists, Catholics, and socialists each sought to shape the future of the empire according to their visions. Elections mattered because they were one of the few formal mechanisms by which citizens could influence policy. However, the electoral system and the limits on parliamentary power meant that outcomes were often a compromise between popular demands and the preferences of the elite. Bismarck's gradual retirement from active power in the 1890s opened new chapters in German life. His successors lacked his singular authority and knack for balancing competing forces, and new leaders pursued policies that sometimes diverged from his cautious realpolitik. Wilhelm II, who became emperor at the turn of the century, had different instincts and ambitions. His belief in a grand imperial destiny and his willingness to intervene more personally in foreign policy led Germany onto a different path. Under Wilhelm II, the imperial government embarked on a more assertive course abroad, seeking a place in the sun through naval expansion and colonial ventures. The escalation of armaments and a bolder diplomacy strained relations with other powers, particularly Britain and France. Naval rivalry and colonial competition added new dimensions to Europe's security dilemmas and contributed to a climate of suspicion and alliance building that would later prove deadly. At home, the tension between modernization and traditional authority continued. Industrialists demanded tariffs and protection for their investments while agrarian elites sought policies that preserved their status. Urban workers continued to press for better wages and working conditions, sometimes through party politics, sometimes through strike actions and mass protest. The empire's political culture could thus be seen as a constant negotiation between forces pulling toward change and those resisting it. Cultural movements also reflected the complexities of identity in the empire. Romanticism in its earlier forms had fed nationalist sentiment, while later artistic and intellectual trends questioned and complicated simple narratives of national greatness. Philosophers, poets, and scientists contributed to a rich public discourse that could inspire but also unsettle. The German language itself became a vehicle for both unity and debate, with newspapers and journals shaping public opinion across regions. Religion remained a potent stroke in the ideological palette of the empire. Protestant-majority regions often aligned closely with Prussian leadership, while Catholic areas maintained distinct networks of church and social life. Jewish communities, many of which had achieved legal emancipation, navigated a precarious position, integrated in many spheres yet subject to prejudice and exclusion in others. These religious dynamics influenced politics, education, and social relations in ways that were sometimes overt and sometimes subtle. Science and technology continued to advance rapidly, altering everyday life and military capabilities alike. Advances in chemistry and engineering led to new products and processes that reshaped industry and medicine. The interplay between universities, private enterprise, and state support created an ecosystem in which innovation flourished. This technical prowess would become a source of national pride and an instrument of power, further linking the empire's identity to its material achievements. The empire also had to manage ethnic and linguistic diversity at its borders. Areas like Alsace-Lorraine, with mixed populations and histories of shifting sovereignty, became focal points of nationalist contestation. Policies toward minorities varied, sometimes promoting assimilation and at other times tolerating distinct identities. The challenge of balancing national unity with ethnic plurality was an ongoing and often unresolved tension. Urbanization transformed the social map of Germany. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich became magnets for people seeking work, education, or a different life. Urban culture, cafes, theaters, newspapers, and clubs thrived and created new forms of association and political mobilization. The urban environment also exposed the limits of public services and the need for municipal reforms in housing, sanitation, and welfare, pushing both local and imperial authorities to respond. The empire's legal and administrative systems extended the reach of the state into everyday transactions and disputes. A growing body of laws regulated commerce, labor relations, and civil rights, creating predictability that business and citizens relied upon. Bureaucracy, though sometimes criticized for its rigidity, provided a framework for governance that connected local officials to imperial policy. This administrative capacity was one of the empire's strengths, enabling large-scale coordination in everything from taxation to education. At the international level, Germany's economic might drew foreign investment and partners, even as diplomatic frictions tightened. Trade networks spread German manufactured goods across Europe and beyond, and German capital financed projects that linked the empire's prosperity to global markets. Yet economic interdependence did not guarantee political harmony. Rivalries and conflicts of interest persisted and sometimes intensified as nations competed for resources and influence. Literature and the arts reflected the ambivalences of modernity. Novelists explored the moral consequences of industrial life, playwrights debated the role of the nation and the individual, and composers staged grand works that spoke to collective identity. Cultural production both celebrated and critiqued the empire, offering listeners and readers ways to think about what it meant to belong to a new and powerful state. This lively cultural scene contributed to a sense of national self-awareness that was complex and sometimes contradictory. Colonial endeavors in Africa and the Pacific added another layer to the empire's outward-looking posture. These ventures were driven by a mix of economic interest, a desire for prestige, and the ideological currents of the time that saw empire as a marker of civilization. Colonial administration often revealed the limits of Germany's experience abroad, and conflicts in these territories exposed moral and strategic dilemmas. The consequences of colonial rule would reverberate both in the colonies and in the imperial center for generations. Science, industry, and empire combined to create a modern military apparatus that was among the most formidable in the world. Conscription, training, and technological innovation ensured that Germany could field armies of impressive quality. This capacity was a source of confidence for German leaders, but it also stoked fear among neighboring nations who watched the balance of force shift. Military strength was thus both a pillar of the state's security and a magnet for international tension. Diplomacy in the late imperial period became increasingly entangled and fraught with misunderstandings. Alliances built to preserve peace occasionally have the opposite effect when miscommunications, national ambitions, and crises intersect. The web of treaties meant to deter aggression also made it difficult for states to step back from confrontations once they began. This dangerous arithmetic of alliance politics was part of the legacy of the century of unification, interconnectedness that could protect or inflame. Intellectual life in the empire fostered debates about law, morality, and the place of the individual in society. Thinkers questioned universal truths and explored a modern understanding of rights and duties. Universities produced not only technical expertise but also philosophers whose ideas influenced public discourse and policy debates. The resulting culture of argument and critique was an engine of intellectual dynamism, yet it also could amplify divisions when political passions ran high. Economically, the empire weathered cycles of boom and bust that affected livelihoods and politics. Periods of rapid growth were followed by sharp downturns, and each economic shock had social and political consequences. Unemployment, migration, and class tensions rose during hard times, challenging the state's ability to manage social unrest. The social insurance programs introduced earlier offered some relief, but economic vulnerability remained a feature of modernizing societies. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the empire faced the task of translating its military and economic strengths into a sustainable and peaceful order. Leaders debated whether to pursue cautious diplomacy or a more assertive posture. Public opinion, shaped by newspapers and speeches, often exalted national achievements and sometimes encouraged confrontational stances. This shifting mood in politics made the balance of power a more brittle thing, subject to accidents and escalating rhetoric. Civic life in the empire involved participation in clubs, guilds, and associations that helped citizens find a public voice outside formal politics. These networks spread ideas and created solidarities that could be mobilized for social causes, charitable work, or political campaigns. The pluralism of association life added resilience to the public sphere, allowing movements to grow organically even when formal institutions were slow to respond. This associational culture mattered for shaping opinions, building movements, and creating ties across class and regional divides. Science and education remained a source of renewal and pride. The German university model, emphasizing research and academic freedom, drew students and scholars from abroad and produced breakthroughs that propelled industries forward. This intellectual capital fueled productivity and contributed to the empire's reputation as a leader in many fields. The exchange between theory and practice, laboratories feeding factories and vice versa, was a hallmark of Germany's modernity. Because the empire was born of war, its founding narrative always included the shadow of force. Military ceremonies, monuments, and commemorations kept the memory of sacrifice alive and intertwined with national identity. These rituals performed social work. They transformed private grief into public honor and knitted individual stories into a collective myth. Yet the same rituals could harden attitudes toward violence and national rivalry, making reconciliation and restraint more difficult in moments of crisis. As industrialization deepened, environmental changes accompanied economic growth. Rivers were channeled for factories, forests cleared for mining, and towns expanded into formerly rural landscapes. The transformation had human costs, pollution, overcrowding, and new health challenges, but also material benefits that raised living standards for many. Debates about regulation and public health emerged as part of the broader conversation about what modern life should look like. Language and literature remained central to the idea of a German nation. Poetry, historical novels, and philosophical works shaped a shared cultural memory that crossed regional lines. The canon of German classics provided a reservoir of reference points that could be drawn upon in political speeches, classrooms, and newspapers. This literary culture helped solidify a common identity while also opening spaces for critique and reinterpretation. Regional particularism never vanished entirely. Bavaria, Saxony, and other lands retained distinct legal traditions, costumes, and customs that gave flavor to the imperial mosaic. Local festivals, dialects, and social practices continued to define everyday life for millions, offering continuity amid the tidal changes of industrial modernity. The coexistence of local attachment and national affiliation was one of the empire's enduring features, making it flexible but also complicated. The role of the press grew in importance as literacy expanded and communication networks became denser. Newspapers shaped public debates, provided information about distant events, and sometimes stoked passions. Censorship was less absolute than in earlier times, but the state still watched the media and intervened when it felt threatened. Journalism thus became a contested space where state power and public voice negotiated the boundaries of permissible speech. In foreign affairs, economic competition often intertwined with political rivalry. Trade disputes, colonial ambitions, and the desire for strategic advantages could all spur diplomatic strains. The birth of the empire had upset old arrangements and required new protocols for negotiation and conflict resolution. The international system adjusted slowly, but the tensions and rivalries created by a powerful Germany would remain a defining feature of European geopolitics. Amid these structural forces, individuals, soldiers, workers, teachers, diplomats, and mothers lived lives shaped by the empire's institutions and by everyday choices. Their private concerns were the practical realities that made policies meaningful or empty. How families adapted to migration, how towns handled industrialization, how soldiers returned from service and reintegrated into society. These stories reveal the human face of state building and remind us that history is made by ordinary lives as much as by grand designs. By the time the first decades of the 20th century arrived, the German Empire had become a complex and deeply interconnected polity. It had achieved remarkable material progress and created a shape of politics that would influence all of Europe. Yet it also carried within it the seeds of future conflict, militaristic dispositions, unresolved social inequalities, and a foreign policy that sometimes sought prestige at the cost of security. The creation of the empire was an achievement of decisive leadership and profound structural change, but it was also the beginning of dilemmas that no short-term policy could easily resolve. Looking back on the birth of the German Empire, what stands out most is the way iron and blood, industry and force, were woven together into a coherent political tapestry. Railways and guns, factories and laws, myths of nationhood and the hard work of administration all combined to build a state that changed the map of Europe. The enterprise was both modern and medieval, enlightened and coercive, humane in its social reforms and ruthless in its military ambitions. That paradox is essential to understanding how the empire was formed and why its story matters. History seldom offers a single cause for great events, and German unification is no exception. It was the product of contingency and design, of technological shifts and human will, of economic tides and the personalities of leaders. Bismarck's genius lay in reading these various streams and channeling them into a force that produced political unity. Yet unity achieved through war and strict hierarchy carried costs as it created expectations and obligations that would shape the century that followed. It's tempting to see the empire as inevitable once one knows the outcome, but the path to unification was full of forks and dangers that could have produced different results. A different alliance here, a different battle there, or the success of a liberal constitutional movement might have taken Central Europe in another direction. The actual outcome depended on decisions taken in smoke-filled chanceries and on battlefields where ordinary men met extraordinary strain. Remembering the fragility of that process helps explain why later tensions escalated so readily. As you listen, imagine the smell of coal and oil, the ringing of hammers in vast foundries, the drumbeat of marching boots, and the hush of diplomatic chambers where paper and pen mattered as much as cannon. Picture a continent in which innovations in chemistry and mechanics moved side by side with traditions of honor and dynastic pride. This was the world that birthed the German Empire, a place where modernity and age-old structures collided to make something new and formidable. What the empire left behind was not only borders and institutions, but also stories that informed national memories, art, and politics. Monuments, songs, and histories remembered victories and mourned defeats. Museums displayed trophies and documents. Families kept private accounts of sacrifice and sacrifice. These narratives shaped generations and became reference points that influenced how later actors understood their place in the world and how they justified their choices. In the end, the rise of the German Empire was a dramatic demonstration of how political imagination, economic transformation, and military organization can interact to create durable political forms. It shows that nationhood can be constructed through a combination of coercion and consent, through the exertion of power and the cultivation of loyalty. The consequences of that creation would ripple outward, affecting the diplomatic landscape of Europe and the lives of millions in ways both intended and unintended. The phrase blood and iron thus captures part of the truth, but not the whole of it. Iron built the material base for power, rails, steelworks, and factories, while blood paid the price in lives and loyalty. Yet between those two poles lay diplomacy, law, education, and daily life, things that are quieter but equally essential in making a nation endure. The German Empire was forged at the intersection of these forces, a product of technology and tactics, of speeches and silencers, of public law and private devotion. As the narrative stretches toward the present, it's worth observing how the empire's creation still informs contemporary debates about power, identity, and the use of force. Modern states face the same dilemmas of integrating diverse populations, balancing authority and liberty, and managing technological change. The German case is a rich study of how these tensions can be negotiated and how sometimes pragmatic solutions carry unexpected long-term consequences. This history also teaches a caution about the seduction of quick fixes through military triumphs or authoritarian measures. The unification of Germany accomplished remarkable things, but it also embedded a disposition toward force that later centuries would wrestle with. Nations built on a mixture of prestige and domination can become brittle when confronted with new pressures, because their internal coherence often depends on external success or the promise of continued ascendancy. Listening to the birth of the German Empire as a long, unfolding story reveals both the grandeur and the dangers of state building. It is a tale of human ingenuity and institutional creativity, of wars fought for strategic advantage and of policies aimed at knitting together diverse peoples. It is also a reminder that the hopes invested in political projects can generate costs that stay with societies for generations. The iron and the blood combine to create a formidable state, but the human dimension of that creation points to the enduring complexity of political life. In the quiet moments after victories are won and treaties signed, the work of governing begins. The German Empire's founders had to translate battlefield success into administrative competence, social policy, and cultural coherence. Their efforts created structures that proved resilient in many ways, and yet those same structures contained contradictions that later leaders could not always manage. The story of unification is therefore inseparable from the subsequent story of governance, the choices that make a state legitimate and the pressures that can erode that legitimacy over time. Every empire faces the same test: winning is easy, ruling is not. Subscribe and share in the comments which part hits you harder, the pride of creation or the weight of keeping it alive. History, at its best, does not moralize so much as illuminate. The birth of the German Empire is not simply a story of villains and heroes, but a complicated human drama with motives both noble and ignoble. Ambition, fear, devotion, calculation, and accident all played their parts. By tracing these threads, we gain clarity about how modern nations come into being and what obligations follow from their creation. If you were traveling through the German landscape in those years, you would see a country being remade. Factories rose where fields had been, towns grew into cities, and trains carved new arteries through forests and plains. Soldiers marched and politicians argued, priests preached and teachers taught. The visible signs of change, smokestacks, barracks, railway stations, were matched by less visible transformations, new legal codes, emergent professional classes, and shifting patterns of allegiance. Those transformations shaped people's expectations about the future. For some, the empire promised security, opportunity, and the thrill of belonging to a rising power. For others, it imposed new constraints and threatened older ways of life. The tension between possibility and loss was part of the daily negotiation that defined the period. How families, communities, and individuals navigated this negotiation determined much of ordinary history. Because the German Empire was a creation of statecraft as much as of force, it invites reflection on the nature of authority. Effective governance often requires a capacity to command and the legitimacy to be obeyed. The empire developed both, but the balance was delicate. When authority is derived from both coercion and consent, changes in public mood or military fortunes can tip the equilibrium, producing either reform or crisis. The story of German unification also intersects with the broader currents of 19th-century Europe, the decline of multi-ethnic empires, the rise of national movements, and the spread of industrial capitalism. Germany's path shared features with Italy's unification but differed in its level of industrial development and the nature of its leadership. Comparing these parallel developments helps us see common patterns and distinct national trajectories, underscoring that European modernization took many forms. In the end, the birth of the German Empire remains a powerful example of how military power, economic modernization, and political craft can combine to create a nation-state. It is a narrative full of energy, ingenuity, and troubling choices. The legacy of that birth informs not only German history but also the larger story of modern Europe, reminding us that the methods of statecraft have consequences that shape the lives of countless people and the contours of international order. If you carry away one image from this long account, let it be of networks, of iron rails, bureaucratic channels, intellectual bonds, and the human ties of family and profession that were woven together into a political fabric. That fabric held because it had been designed to do so, but it also strained because it had been formed under pressure. Understanding the birth of the German Empire means attending to both the craftsman's intent and the seams he stitched, the materials chosen and the where they would endure. And so the story continues beyond the immediate act of unification. The empire's creation was the beginning of a new historical chapter, not a final solution. Its institutions had to be maintained, its social contracts renewed, and its foreign relations constantly negotiated. The choices made in the decades after 1871 would determine whether the project matured into a stable and progressive polity or whether its internal tensions and external rivalries would produce conflict. That unresolved potential is what keeps the history of the German Empire alive in our imagination and worthy of deep study. Listen, and imagine the map of Central Europe in the early 19th century, a patchwork of duchies, principalities, free cities, and kingdoms, each beating with its own laws, tolls, and customs. Travel was slow and commerce slower, with borders that turned a short trip into a series of bureaucratic negotiations. Yet beneath that fragmentation there was an energy gathering. Craftsmen, merchants, and landowners who sensed that something different, something larger, might be possible if the pieces could be joined. This sense of possibility, fragile and diffuse at first, would become the seed of a new power, the German Empire. To understand how an empire made itself in a place of princes, you must first meet the age that unmade and remade Europe, the Napoleonic era, which tore down old institutions and, paradoxically, paved the way for consolidation. When Napoleon reorganized the continent, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and pressured many small states into new configurations, consolidating territories and introducing administrative, legal, and fiscal reforms. Those reforms modernized regions in ways that could not simply be undone. They introduced standardized laws, codified rights, and a bureaucratic logic that later reformers would use as building blocks. The shock of war and occupation also kindled new political thinking about national identity, sovereignty, and the relationship between ruler and ruled. After the storm of revolution and empire came a quieter, economic rearrangement, the Zollverein, a customs union first led by Prussia, which knitted many German states into a single economic space without immediate political union. The removal of internal tariffs made markets larger overnight. Goods flowed more freely, merchants found new customers, and entrepreneurs began thinking beyond provincial horizons. Railways and telegraphs soon followed, not as mere technology but as social infrastructure that shortened distances and aligned economic interests across borders. Economic unity, in a sense, began to prefigure political unity. It created vested interests that would later favor a single sovereign framework to protect and promote industry. Industry itself would be the engine of transformation. In the coal-rich valleys of the Ruhr and the forests of Silesia and Saxony, mines and foundries multiplied, feeding a booming iron and steel sector that became the backbone of modern German power. Railways stitched the landscape together and stimulated demand for iron, steel, locomotives, and rolling stock. Factories rose where rivers and canals could carry raw materials, and where capital and skilled labor could be found, small workshops grew into sprawling complexes, inventors turned experiments into patents, and engineers acquired social prestige previously reserved for the learned professions. Alongside industrial growth, there was a banking revolution. New financial institutions, like the joint stock banks and the early universal banks, marshaled salvation for enterprises that needed huge amounts of capital and persuaded conservative money to underwrite far-reaching projects. Banking houses learned to arrange large-scale investment in railroads, coal and iron works, and international trade, turning regional wealth into something that could build a national economy. That financial integration meant that economic elites across various states shared interests that strengthened the call for political consolidation, for stability, and for uniform policies that would secure capital and markets. Yet economics alone could not forge a nation. What held these developments together was political will and the particular genius of a few key figures, above all Otto von Bismarck. He was a master of pragmatic statecraft, a man more at ease with manipulation and power than with lofty ideology. He saw the chance to use conflicts, wars, and diplomatic crises, not to create chaos but to strengthen Prussia's hand, to consolidate German-speaking lands under a leadership that could claim both military prowess and administrative competence. His method, often called realpolitik, treated power as an instrument and political alliances as adjustable tools rather than as sacred commitments. Bismarck's first great stroke was to reorder the map of Germany by engineering wars that isolated enemies and won prestige. He provoked and managed conflict with Denmark to snatch Schleswig and Holstein, then used a diplomatic split with Austria to create a new Germanic order in which Prussia, not Vienna, would take the leading role. The decisive moment came with the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict manufactured and framed to unite disparate German states behind a common external enemy. The speed and decisiveness of Prussia's military victories produced a wave of national euphoria across German territories, and that tide carried with it political union. On a cold January day in 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, kings and princes and crowned heads gathered, and there, under the ornate gaze of French humiliation, the Prussian king was proclaimed German emperor. It was a symbolic act of unity that wrapped political pragmatism in ceremonial majesty, and it codified a new order in which an emperor would preside over a federation of states. This empire, officially the Deutsches Kaiserreich, was not a centralized nation-state in the French sense. It remained a federal construct, a complex blend of dynastic privilege, regional autonomy, and national institutions. Yet that compromise provided the stability necessary for an industrial giant to take shape. Prussia's dominance in the empire was unmistakable, and with it a distinct social architecture. The Junkers, the Prussian landed aristocracy, maintained control of the military and much of the civil bureaucracy. Their vast estates and conservative values stood in tension with the modernizing forces of cities and factories. The emperor and his circle tended to favor order, hierarchy, and the military virtues that the Junkers embodied, and those preferences shaped policy, staffing, and the culture of authority. At the same time, the growing urban bourgeoisie, industrialists, and professional classes pressed for liberty in commerce, expansion of education, and more influence in government, creating a dynamic tension within the polity. Bismarck, pragmatic as ever, did not seek to crush liberalism or industry but to incorporate them when useful and restrain them when necessary. He feared the radicalism of revolution and, more immediately, the rising appeal of socialism among factory workers. His answer combined repression and concession. Anti-socialist laws banned parties and unions in an attempt to suppress dissent, while the state simultaneously introduced landmark social legislation, pensions, health insurance, and accident insurance to win the working class's loyalty. This dual strategy was a political experiment in social engineering, an attempt to turn the legitimacy of the state into a social contract that undercut revolutionary fervor. The Kulturkampf, another of Bismarck's domestic campaigns, revealed the complicated mixture of ideology and power in the new empire. Designed to reduce the political influence of the Catholic Church, especially in parts of Germany where Catholics maintained separate loyalties, it entailed state controls over clergy and education. The struggle did not fully succeed and eventually yielded to accommodation, but it exposed the tensions between a Protestant-dominated state and the religious plurality of the German lands. Religion thus became another arena in which the imperial project sought uniformity and sometimes overreached, producing backlash and recalibration. Military reform and organization were central to the rise of German power in this era. Prussia's military ethos became the template for the entire empire. Conscription, rigorous training, a professional officer corps, and an innovative general staff produced an army that prided itself on discipline, planning, and operational excellence. The general staff, with its culture of meticulous preparation and war games, turned strategic thinking into a national practice and became a model others studied and feared. This martial culture also shaped civilian life. Parades, uniforms, and an emphasis on duty suffused public ritual and gave the state a stoic, often intimidating presence. Industry and the military were not separate phenomena but symbiotic partners. The factories supplied steel and armaments, engineers developed technologies that military planners adopted eagerly. Companies like Krupp became household names, synonymous with heavy industry and weaponry, blending entrepreneurial drive with nationalist symbolism. The growth of armaments and military infrastructure boosted related sectors, shipbuilding, chemicals, and mechanical engineering, creating a technologically sophisticated industrial base. That industrial base, in turn, underpinned Germany's capacity to act forcefully on the world stage. Science and education were another pillar of German ascendancy. Universities and technical schools emphasized rigorous research and practical application, producing chemists, physicists, and engineers of exceptional skill. The culture of precision, laboratory discipline, and industrial patronage created breakthroughs that had global impact. Dye chemistry, pharmaceuticals, and electrical engineering became areas of German leadership. This intellectual vitality made the nation more than a political and economic power. It made it a center of modern knowledge and innovation, and that reputation attracted talent and investment from across the continent. Cities swelled as peasants and craftsmen moved to towns in search of factory work and a better life, transforming social relations and urban landscapes. Berlin became a vast hub of administration, culture, and commerce, while other cities like Hamburg, Mannheim, and Essen turned into industrial beacons. Urban life brought crowded tenements and social strain, but it also generated new forms of social organization, clubs, newspapers, theaters, and political associations where new identities and debates were forged. The metropolis offered both the promise of upward mobility and the reality of inequality, and both realities compelled political response. As industry matured, it brought with it a new class of industrial magnates and a modern capitalist culture that valued efficiency, scale, and corporate organization. Cartels and trusts emerged to regulate competition in sectors like coal, steel, and chemicals, stabilizing prices and coordinating production. Management science evolved, cultivating professional executives who ran complex enterprises across regions. The result was a layered economy in which family-owned firms, joint stock corporations, and powerful banks acted in concert, sometimes in concert with the state, to shape national priorities. Trade and colonial ambitions grew in parallel, for raw materials and markets were necessary for the empire's continued expansion. German merchants and shipowners pushed into global commerce, and the state began to pursue overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific. These colonial endeavors brought prestige and commercial opportunity but also exposed darker realities: conquest, exploitation, and violent suppression of indigenous populations, episodes that left moral stains on the imperial project and complicated its legacy. Overseas expansion also carried strategic implications, drawing Germany into rivalry with established powers like Britain and France, who saw German ambition as a threat to their own global interests. On the diplomatic stage, Bismarck was an architect of peace through alliances, seeking to protect the new empire by isolating France and building a network of agreements that would secure Germany's borders. He crafted the League of the Three Emperors and later the Dual Alliance with Austria-Hungary, balancing relations with Russia and drawing a diplomatic map that aimed at stability. Bismarck's genius lay in preventing encirclement and avoiding entangling commitments that might drag the empire into unwanted wars. His retirement and eventual fall from power would reveal how much of that delicate architecture depended on his particular skill. When Kaiser Wilhelm I sat on the throne, he was a figure of respect and continuity, a symbol whose authority helped legitimize the new national order. But the imperial crown always cast a shadow that grew longer in the decades that followed, especially under his successor, Wilhelm II, whose personality would imprint itself on the nation. Wilhelm II was energetic, impulsive, and eager to make his mark. He wanted Germany to be respected, feared, and admired, and he distrusted the restrained balance that Bismarck had cultivated. The clash between a restless emperor and a cautious chancellor was to reshape imperial policy in ways that few had foreseen. The dismissal of Bismarck in 1890 was a turning point. Without the old chancellor's diplomatic steadying hand, the empire's foreign policy shifted from guarded diplomacy to a more assertive posture, often described as Weltpolitik or world policy. The aim was to secure colonies, a larger navy, and a place at the imperial table of powers. Weltpolitik reflected new ambitions and new anxieties. Industrial Germany wanted not only markets but also international prestige to match its economic strength. That ambition, however, produced friction with Britain and France and helped set the stage for the rivalries of the 20th century. Under Wilhelm II, the naval race with Britain became a visible sign of changing priorities. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz and his naval laws pushed for a fleet that could challenge British sea power and protect German interests overseas. Shipyards expanded, steel and coal were redirected to naval construction, and public opinion came to be fed by images of a rising navy. For Britain, the German fleet was a direct challenge to its command of the seas, and the two nations spiraled into suspicion and costly competition. Navalism reshaped industrial priorities and consumed political energy in ways that had consequences far beyond the docks. At home, the political system of the empire was a complex architecture that mixed hereditary power with embryonic parliamentary forms. The Reichstag, elected by male suffrage, could debate and represent interests, yet the emperor and the chancellor, accountable to the monarch rather than to the parliament, retained decisive authority. The Bundesrat, representing the constituent states, had significant sway over legislation, preserving the influence of regional rulers. This hybrid system produced both stability and frustration. It allowed for representative institutions while keeping ultimate power in hands that often preferred paternal command over popular mandate. The rise of political parties paralleled industrialization. Liberals advocated for trade and civil liberties, conservatives defended order and tradition, and the Social Democratic Party emerged as the voice of industrial labor and mass politics. The SPD grew rapidly by organizing workers, offering education and advocating social reform, and it became the largest party by membership in the Reichstag by the early 20th century. That growth worried the conservative establishment and shaped policies from repression to concession, and it highlighted the paradox of an industrialized democracy that still paused before true parliamentary accountability. Culture and identity were constantly being reinterpreted in this new national setting. Romantic nationalism lingered in the arts and in the memory of folktales and music, while modern culture celebrated scientific success and urban sophistication. Composers, writers, and painters engaged with both the past and the present, and cultural institutions, museums, universities, and theaters became sites where a collective German identity was performed and debated. Language, history, and education were marshaled as tools of integration, but local traditions and regional dialects remained stubborn, reminding everyone that unity had been achieved without uniformity. Education itself was a battleground of values. The system of gymnasia and universities prized classical learning for elites and professional training for those destined to serve the state or industry. Technical schools produced the engineers whose skills powered industry, while the university system promoted research that extended Germany's scientific lead. The state intervened in curricula and administration to shape citizens and professionals in the image of national needs, creating a pedagogy that combined rigor with purpose. Social life in the empire was a continuing negotiation between tradition and modernity. Marriage patterns shifted as urban wage labor changed family economies, and consumer culture emerged with department stores, advertising, and leisure activities. Sports, clubs, and associations became outlets for civic engagement. They also fostered bonds that transcended class lines while reinforcing social hierarchies. This social fabric supported industrial growth and political stability, but it also hid tensions over wages, housing, and political voice that would erupt when expectations outpaced accommodations. The legal and administrative system of the empire reflected its hybrid nature. Modern codified laws existed alongside ancient privileges and local customs. Civil law and commercial codes provided predictability for business, while local law and princely authority preserved old prerogatives. The bureaucracy grew as a professional class that administered taxation, infrastructure, and public services, demonstrating the state's capacity to manage the complexities of industrial society. That administrative competence became a source of legitimacy for a regime that relied equally on spectacle and performance as on municipal competence to secure allegiance. The empire's cultural projection abroad was marked by confident scholarship and a taste for technical excellence. Laboratories, institutes, and academies in Germany attracted students from around the world. German scholarship in philology, chemistry, physics, and philosophy enjoyed global renown, and that prestige translated into soft power. Scientific conferences and cultural exchanges made Germany a focal point of intellectual life, and its brands and factories were visible in foreign markets. International cultural presence reinforced the narrative that Germany had arrived not only as a political actor but as a civilizational force. Industrial labor itself developed organizational muscles that challenged traditional authorities. Trade unions expanded slowly and strategically, learning how to negotiate for wages and conditions while avoiding outright revolt. Strikes and protests were part of the new urban script, and the state's response combined policing with legislation and social reform. Labor's rising voice forced employers and politicians to reckon with social costs of industrial progress, shifting the terms of political debate from abstract rights to concrete living conditions. Science and industry also birthed environmental consequences that were becoming visible in the late 19th century: smog over industrial towns, polluted rivers, and exhausted soils in regions of intense extractive activity. These problems affected health and living standards, prompting public concern and local interventions that anticipated modern environmental policy debates. Rivers once clean became transportation corridors and waste channels, landscapes were reshaped to facilitate industrial output, and communities adapted or moved in response. The environmental legacy would become one of the less discussed but enduring aspects of industrial empire. Colonial adventures, which once promised easy gains, encountered unexpected realities. Governing overseas territories proved costly and often brutal, and colonial administrators were forced into compromises between economic exploitation and the costs of suppressing resistance. The moral contradictions of imperial rule were masked for a time by nationalist rhetoric and commercial interests, but reports from the colonies and missionary accounts eventually made debates back home more complex. These distant conflicts sometimes reshaped domestic politics, influencing voters and policymakers who were beginning to see empire as a burden as well as a prize. The press and public opinion were potent forces in the empire's evolution. Newspapers, pamphlets, and emerging mass media circulated ideas rapidly, shaping public perceptions of foreign crises, industrial disputes, and political scandals. Sensational stories could inflame nationalist fervor or temper it, and editors wielded influence that made political stability contingent on narrative as much as on force. The modern state had to learn to manage information, and its attempts to do so, through censorship, patronage, and political messaging, reveal a deepening interplay between communication and power. Art and architecture in the empire reflected national aspirations, combining historicist styles with modern needs. Buildings evoked imperial grandeur even as factories and warehouses met practical demands, and public monuments commemorated victories and heroes, shaping collective memory. Photography captured urban life and industry, giving the public visual evidence of progress, while literature described the social transformations, from the exhilaration of success to the anxieties of those left behind. Cultural production both celebrated and critiqued the new order, offering a mirror in which society could examine itself. The legal repression of socialist organizations, though severe at times, could not halt the ideological currents sweeping through Europe. Socialists refined their tactics, finding ways to organize under pressure and to leverage legal openings when they appeared. Their arguments about inequality, labor rights, and the distribution of power resonated with many, particularly as industrialization produced visible disparities. Political pressure forced conservatives to think differently about governance, welfare, and the limits of coercion in a modernizing society. Despite internal conflicts, the German Empire constructed a formidable educational and public health system that raised living standards for many, if unevenly. Public hygiene campaigns, vaccination drives, and city sanitation projects reduced death rates and improved life expectancy in urban areas. Investments in vocational education created a skilled workforce that industry craved, while public institutions like museums and libraries broadened civic literacy. These public goods, however, were produced alongside policies that preserved traditional hierarchies, reminding citizens that social progress came with political caveats. Technological innovation kept Germany competitive on the world stage. Chemical dyes, pharmaceuticals, electrical equipment, and engine design were sectors in which German firms led and exported their expertise. The patent system encouraged inventors and protected industrial property, thereby stimulating further research and commercialization. This technical leadership made German goods desirable globally and tied foreign consumers to German industry in a web of dependence that had geopolitical implications. Because progress was uneven, regional disparities persisted within the empire. The industrial West and South advanced rapidly, while rural East and agricultural provinces often lagged, preserving older social relations and structures. That unevenness meant that national policy had to juggle conflicting interests. Agrarian elites feared the loss of status, industrialists demanded protection and expansion, and workers sought fair conditions. Managing this balancing act made governance complicated and often required compromise that left all sides partially dissatisfied. The expansion of infrastructure, railways, telegraph networks, ports, and canals transformed the geography of the empire and lowered transaction costs in commerce and governance. Rail timetables connected far-flung towns to markets and army deployments alike, while the telegraph allowed near-instant communication for administration and diplomacy. Infrastructure investment represented both strategic planning and a commitment to modern statecraft, enabling swift mobilization of resources when required and knitting the economy together in ways that reinforced central power. The social imagination of the time was animated by a sense that Germany was building something enduring, a national project that combined ancestral pride with modern capability. This cultural narrative drew from history, folklore, and the achievements of the present to create a story about destiny and mission. Yet that same narrative could be exclusionary, defining insiders and outsiders in ways that marginalized minorities and dissenters. National identity, therefore, was both inclusive in its promise of belonging and exclusive in its demands for conformity. The legal and political mechanisms of the empire allowed for reform but placed limits on rapid democratization, producing steady incremental change rather than revolutionary transformation. Electoral politics mattered and could shift public discourse, but the architecture of authority guaranteed that major reforms required accommodation from elites. This meant that social legislation, educational expansion, and industry-friendly policies could be enacted, but more radical democratizing drives found their progress constrained by structural features of the regime. The result was a mixed modernization, a synthesis of conservative institutional continuity and selective progressive change. Internationally, the German Empire's rise changed the calculations of other powers, prompting new alliances and rivalries that would harden over time. Britain recalibrated its naval strategy, France nursed grievances and looked for counterweights, and Russia weighed opportunities against obligations. Diplomatic crises, colonial competitions, and economic interdependence created a Europe that was more connected and more volatile. The empire was thus both an engine of modernization and a source of tension whose effects reverberated well beyond its borders. Individual personalities shaped the empire as much as institutions did. Bismarck's realism, Wilhelm Tell's dynamism, and the industrialist's entrepreneurial zeal all left distinctive marks on policy and public life. Ministers, generals, bankers, and editors each played roles in the drama of nation-building, and their decisions, sometimes cautious, sometimes rash, set trajectories that could not be easily reversed. The interplay of agency and structure meant that the empire's path was neither inevitable nor monolithic. It was the outcome of choices made by men and women functioning within powerful historical forces. The cultural memory of the German Empire after its establishment continued to be contested and reinterpreted by successive generations. Some remembered it as a period of technical mastery, social order, and national pride. Others recalled repression, colonial violence, and the perils of militarism. Memory itself became a political instrument, marshaled by later actors to justify, condemn, or revise the narrative of the imperial past. The empire's legacy, therefore, was not a settled thing but a field of dispute in which future politics would be rooted. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the German Empire looked outward with ambition and inward with a mixture of confidence and unease. Its industrial might was unmatched in parts of Europe, its universities were world-leading, and its political system provided a framework for sustained development. Yet beneath those strengths lay contradictions: inclusivity and exclusion, modernization and tradition, diplomacy and confrontation, that would shape its future. The shadow of the Kaiser, both literal and metaphorical, loomed larger as the state negotiated its place among empires. When you consider the rise of the German Empire, think of it as a mosaic of forces: industry that transformed landscapes and livelihoods, legal and administrative reforms that knit disparate polities together, and personalities who navigated the dangerous shoals of power. Each tile of that mosaic, railway, factory, law, proclamation, treaty, contributed its own color to a picture that was magnificent to contemporaries and problematic to posterity. The long story of industrial triumph, political engineering, and imperial aspiration did not resolve neatly. It continued to influence European and global affairs in ways that shaped the century to come. In the end, the German Empire's ascent teaches a lesson about the unpredictable alchemy of modernization. Economic integration can precede political unity. Technological brilliance can coexist with social strife, and a potent mixture of diplomacy and force can produce an order that is both stable and brittle. The shadow of the Kaiser, his image of dignity, his ambitions, his missteps, served as a constant reminder that leadership matters, that the temper and temperament of rulers can accelerate or deflect the currents of history. The empire's story is therefore not only one of structural causes but also of human choices that cast long shadows across time. So travel again in your mind across the industrial landscapes, feel the rumble of trains, smell the coal smoke and hear the clang of foundry hammers, and remember how those sounds were the soundtrack of a nation assembling itself. See the halls of power where treaties were made, the classrooms where scientists debated, the streets where workers organized, and the ocean lanes where merchant ships and naval vessels crossed paths. Each scene is a piece of the same continuous narrative, an account of how industry, unity, and the figure of the Kaiser combined to raise a power that reshaped Europe and left a legacy that continues to be studied, argued about, and felt to this day. The story opens in a Europe still learning to breathe after maps were redrawn, and at the heart of that reshaping stood the German Empire, a new colossus forged from iron and diplomacy. It took shape in 1871 beneath vaulted ceilings of Versailles, a proclamation that stitched together kingdoms and principalities into a single imperial banner. The moment felt like triumph, but within that splendor lay the seeds of future conflicts, a mixture of ambition, fear, and the relentless modernization of war. Always, the empire would carry both the glow of achievement and the shadow of consequence as it moved toward the 20th century. From the first days of its existence, the German Empire lived with a soldier's rhythm, for the armies that had helped create it remained central to its identity and policy. Military parades and carefully staged ceremonies made martial virtue visible to ordinary citizens, and officer corps held immense prestige in towns and rural villages alike. Yet beneath the brass and epaulets, the bureaucracy of mobilization hummed, factories were refitted for rifles and shells, and the modern state learned to count its power in men and machines. Those preparations would later be judged as prudence or provocation depending on which side of the battlefield one stood. Prussia's field marshals and Bismarck's realpolitik set patterns of power that would shape generations, and they did so without imagining every consequence. Otto von Bismarck's diplomatic skill created a complicated system of alliances meant to preserve the new status quo, but his successors altered that architecture, and the fragile balance began to creak. When Wilhelm II came to the throne with a temperament for spectacle and a taste for maritime prestige, policies shifted toward a bolder world role known as Weltpolitik. That pursuit of global stature would entangle Germany in naval rivalries and colonial contests that echoed across oceans and ports. The age of steel and steam had turned the scales of conflict, and industry became both engine and arsenal. German factories in the Ruhr and Saxony expanded by the decade, producing locomotives, ships, and artillery with a speed and precision that impressed allies and adversaries. Inventors and engineers fed the military with new tools, quick-firing guns, more reliable explosives, and the beginnings of mechanized transport that would later transform logistics. That material might brought confidence, but it also taught a stark lesson. Once nations could make weapons faster than they could resolve disputes, the pressure toward armed confrontation increased. As Germany cast its gaze outward, colonies were taken in Africa and the Pacific, places where imperial ambitions met local resistance with tragic consequences. In those remote theaters, the empire tested policies and tactics that would reverberate back home, and commanders often acted with a brutality that stained the imperial enterprise. The uprisings against colonial rule were met with force and served as a rehearsal for suppression and governance that blurred lines between soldiering and policing. These episodes widened Germany's world but narrowed its moral latitude, and the costs would not be measured solely in treasure or territory. At sea, a rivalry with Britain crystallized into a contest of dreadnoughts and pride. Admiral Tirpitz's naval bills and the building of increasingly powerful battleships were meant to secure recognition as a global power, yet every keel launched intensified London's suspicions. The naval arms race created a climate in which every new warship became a symbol, a wager that others might see as a threat demanding countermeasures. These tensions turned harbors and shipyards into stages where national wills were dramatized, and the world watched as ironclad ambitions swelled. The web of alliances across Europe bound empires to one another in chains that could transmit shock as easily as strength. On paper, these agreements promised security, but in practice they multiplied the consequences of local crises. A quarrel at a border or the assassination of an official had the potential to set off a cascade of mobilizations, declarations, and ultimatums that no single ministry could halt alone. Thus, the diplomatic architecture intended to prevent war contained, paradoxically, the capacity to make a regional spark into a global inferno. When the summer of 1914 arrived, the assassination in Sarajevo was the match near the tinderbox, and the German Empire found itself drawn into a conflict that would dwarf previous wars. The imperial leadership faced choices under pressure: how to support an ally, how to deter enemies, and how to reconcile public expectation with the sober logistics of modern war. Mobilization plans breathed like clockwork, and once activated they acquired a force of their own, driving states toward action that leaders might have preferred to avoid. The escalation that followed was swift, and soon Europe stood under the shadow of a continent-spanning struggle. The Schlieffen Plan, imagined as a rapid flanking maneuver through Belgium to crush France before turning east, was as much a product of bureaucratic obsession as of military logic. It assumed timing and obedience, and it relied on rail schedules and precise coordination that left little room for delay or diplomacy. When that plan was set in motion, it forced Germany into a violation of Belgian neutrality that shocked public opinion and drew Britain into the conflict. The Great Gamble demonstrated how a technical solution designed for one scenario could reshape international alignments and moral perceptions overnight. From the first clash of men and artillery, the Western Front became a landscape of attrition where tactics and technology collided with human endurance. Trenches tumbled across fields and villages, a continuous scar that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and life there followed rhythms of boredom, terror, and sudden violence. Soldiers wrote letters that were careful and intimate. Men who had been craftsmen, students, and fathers now measured their days by the crack of rifle fire and the smell of cordite. Commanders sought breakthroughs through artillery barrages and infantry charges, but the earth stubbornly held its ground, turning heroic offensives into months of grinding loss. The first weeks on both sides were full of movement and expectation, but soon the war found a new geometry: depth over width, defense over dash, and an industrialized hunger for shells. Artillery came to dominate the battlefield, its barrages rearranging both landscape and life, hollowing out trees and leveling farms. Machine guns turned open ground into a killing field, and barbed wire scarred the approaches to enemy lines, simple but devastating obstacles to anyone who had to cross them. Technology magnified lethality while tactics slowly adapted, often lagging behind the inventions that created more effective means of destruction. In the East, the war looked different because distance and mobility mattered more than trenches. The German army, along with Austria-Hungary, faced Russian forces across a vast theater where railways and weather could be as decisive as a general's plan. Battles there were sometimes more mobile, with sweeping maneuvers and retreats that left towns to the mercy of shifting lines. Yet the human cost remained supreme, and defeats and victories on that front carried enormous political weight inside the empire, for the Eastern War exposed vulnerabilities that demanded attention and resources. The naval war turned oceans into arenas of blockade and submarine menace, and Germany's U-boat campaign introduced a terrifying new uncertainty for commerce and civilian life. Submarines could lurk unseen, and their attacks on merchant shipping brought neutral nations into an anxious calculus about safety and supplies. Britain's blockade of German ports aimed to strangle the empire economically, and shortages of food and materials began to intrude on the home front, altering daily routines and altering loyalties. War at sea wasn't only about fleets meeting in battle, it was about sustaining a society across months and years of deprivation and improvisation. As the conflict deepened, the German home front was transformed by necessity into a machinery of total war. Factories retooled for munition production night and day, and women entered the workforce in vast numbers to replace men at the front. Propaganda, too, became an instrument to maintain morale and justify sacrifices. It simplified complex realities into narratives of heroism and duty that could be shared at kitchen tables and in public squares. Yet beneath the platitudes, families counted ration coupons and mourned the dead, and the rhythms of ordinary life were recast under a constant pressure of scarcity and anxiety. Medical services struggled to adapt to the scale of injury and disease that modern industrial warfare produced, and surgeons developed techniques under conditions of urgency that would have been unimaginable a generation before. Crushed limbs, gas wounds, and the peculiar trauma of trench life demanded innovations in surgery and prosthetics, while hospitals became sites of improvisation and grim compassion. Nurses and volunteer organizations, often led by women, extended care beyond the hospitals, forming a network of relief that was both technically advanced and emotionally fraught. Survival rates improved over the course of the war, but so did the number of lives altered forever by scars both visible and hidden. The introduction of chemical weapons brought a new layer of horror to battlefields and barracks alike, a technology meant to break the stalemate but which instead added a pall of panic to attacks. Soldiers learned to recognize the odor of chlorine and the symptoms of exposure, and gas masks became an essential but imperfect protection. The morality of using such weapons was debated even as they were deployed, and the psychological imprint on survivors contributed to a memory of the war as not only bloody but contaminated by a sense of modernity gone awry. These poison clouds moved the conflict into an era where ethical boundaries were tested along with tactical ones. Air power emerged from reconnaissance to become a weapon of its own, and the sight of biplanes and later monoplanes over the front lines changed how commanders conceived of space and vulnerability. Pilots were celebrated as new-style knights, romantic figures drawn from a culture that longed for clean personal honor amid mechanized carnage, yet their missions were deadly and their triumphs often brief. Observation balloons, aircraft cameras, and eventually bombing runs extended the battlefield vertically, bringing civilians and factories into the scope of military strategy. The sky itself had become another ground for contest, a realm where technology and bravery met in volatile ways. The pressure of prolonged warfare produced crackling political strains within the German Empire, where the monarchy, parliament, and military institutions jostled for influence. Emperors and chancellors corresponded with generals, and public opinion pulled at the threads of power with petitions and strikes. Socialist movements gained traction by arguing that the war's burden fell unevenly on workers, while conservative voices called for unflagging support of the nation's arms. These tensions complicated decision-making and created an internal battlefield as fraught as any trench. By 1916 and 1917, casualties and exhaustion had begun to erode the initial euphoria and resolve that had carried societies into war. Battles like Verdun and the Somme became synonymous with slaughter and stagnant progress, and their names entered the language as shorthand for grinding futility. The loss of life rippled through towns and families, and the constant presence of casualty lists in newspapers made grief an unending public ritual. Soldiers returning home were fewer and often changed, and the demographic and emotional toll began to shape politics and culture in ways that would endure long after the guns fell silent. Internationally, the German Empire navigated alliances and neutral states as it sought to maintain advantage, and far-flung theaters in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia added layers to a conflict that had become global. Colonial possessions and imperial networks brought the war to unexpected places, where local actors seized opportunities for autonomy or revenge, complicating the image of a monolithic imperial campaign. Naval skirmishes and land engagements in remote regions drew resources and attention, illustrating that a world-spanning empire could not escape global currents when war struck. The entanglement of colonies and metropoles showed how empires made conflict truly international. Economic strains multiplied as the war dragged on, and the German economy, once a motor of growth, began to stagger under blockade and the demands of sustaining millions of soldiers. Food shortages became regular, and the rationing system that governments devised could not easily replace the lost nutrients and variety that people had once taken for granted. Black markets and corruption emerged as shadow economies adapted to scarcity, while industrial output shifted toward essentials for war, often at the expense of consumer goods. Those who remained at home discovered that endurance was not merely a civic virtue but a daily necessity that required ingenuity and solidarity. The social fabric of the empire was stretched as class and regional differences shaped experiences of sacrifice and protest, and the bonds that had once seemed secure began to fray. Urban workers faced layoffs and food shortages, rural communities contended with requisitions and lost labor, and families across the country adjusted their routines to support war production. Strikes and demonstrations, though often suppressed, signaled that popular patience was not infinite, and political leaders could not simply assume compliance. These internal pressures influenced military policy and diplomatic options, for no government could fight effectively without a consenting, or at least tolerating, population. Propaganda became an art of persuasion designed to turn complex realities into clear narratives of righteousness and duty, and Germany, like other powers, invested heavily in shaping public perception. Posters, pamphlets, and newspapers simplified suffering into heroic sacrifice, while censorship removed messages that could demoralize or complicate the official line. Intellectuals and artists were enlisted to argue that the struggle was necessary and noble, and the cultural production of war created images that would haunt memory long afterward. Yet beneath those crafted stories, people continued to argue, mourn, and question, and private doubts often diverged sharply from public declarations. The Kaiser himself, Wilhelm II, played a role that was symbolically potent and politically consequential, for his image and decisions were woven into the national story of war. Charismatic and unpredictable, he attracted admiration and criticism in equal measure, and his public speeches and visits to troops were meant to sustain morale. At the same time, his relationships with military leaders and foreign monarchs shaped the diplomatic environment in ways that were sometimes productive and sometimes reckless. The person of the emperor thus became a focal point for debates over responsibility and authority as the war demanded both unity and accountability. Letters from the front provided intimate testimony of how ordinary soldiers perceived the conflict, and such correspondence reveals a spectrum of feelings from pride to despair. Men described comradeship in the trenches, the rituals of mourning for fallen friends, and the strange normalcy of daily routines punctuated by moments of intense fear. They also conveyed a stubborn hope that their sacrifices would secure a better peace, a hope that would be tested by the war's prolonged cruelty. Those voices, preserved in archives and private collections, remind us that history is not only the record of strategies and treaties but the accumulation of countless personal experiences. Women, who had taken on unprecedented roles during the war, found their lives transformed in ways that reshaped post-war society, whether or not immediate recognition followed. They ran households in the absence of men, worked in factories and laundries, and provided medical and administrative services that kept states functioning. Even as patriarchy sought to reassert itself after the conflict, the memory of female contributions would become a touchstone for later social and political movements. The wartime empowerment of women thus carried seeds of change that would continue to sprout in the interwar years and beyond. At sea, the German Navy and its U-boats challenged the British stranglehold on maritime supremacy, using stealth and surprise to threaten vital supply lines. Submarine warfare blurred the distinction between combatant and civilian targets and drew condemnation when passenger ships were sunk, increasing the moral and diplomatic fallout for Germany. The decision to pursue unrestricted submarine warfare was a gamble intended to break the blockade, but it risked provoking neutrals and shortening the threshold to American involvement. In this high-stakes game, tactics at sea had political consequences on land that commanders had to weigh alongside immediate military benefits. The entry of new powers into the war, most notably the United States in 1917, tilted the balance in ways that German planners had hoped to avoid. American industrial capacity and manpower promised reinforcement for weary Allied armies and undercut the endurance-based calculations that had sustained the Central Powers. The psychological impact of a new world power entering the fray was also significant, for morale among soldiers and civilians could be as decisive as artillery barrages. Once international escalation brought fresh resources against the empire, the strategic picture shifted and options narrowed for those seeking a decisive reversal. Blockade-induced famine and shortages at home deepened political unrest, and as suffering intensified, so did the calls for peace from elements across the German political spectrum. War weariness bred new movements and revived old ones. Socialists who had supported the war effort in its first months now clamored for negotiations and reforms. The military leadership, for its part, persisted in pursuing battlefield advantage even as the civilian population faltered, creating a rift between the aims of soldiers and the needs of citizens. Those contradictions grew into crisis points by 1918, when both fronts and homesides teetered on collapse. The spring offensives of 1918 represented a final, desperate attempt by the German High Command to win before American forces could arrive in overwhelming numbers, and for a time those attacks achieved startling penetrations. New stormtrooper tactics and concentrated artillery smashed through lines that had seemed unbreakable, and hopes of victory flared in a country exhausted by war. Yet logistics, exhaustion, and the sheer weight of fresh Allied forces blunted the advance, and by summer the initiative had shifted to the opposing coalition. The period showed both the ingenuity and the limits of the German military when confronted with the cumulative burdens of mobilization. As the tides turned against the empire, revolutionary sentiment found fertile ground among soldiers and sailors who had grown disillusioned with war and monarchy alike. Mutinies at sea and strikes in the city spoke to the depth of discontent, and political radicals, social democrats, and ordinary citizens converged on demands for profound change. The monarchy's capacity to command loyalty dwindled rapidly, and the old dynastic structures that had seemed eternal began to shake. This internal upheaval accelerated the end of the old order and set the stage for a fragile transition to peace and new political forms. The armistice in November 1918 brought a sudden and ambiguous silence after years of sustained noise and devastation, and it left the German people with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Soldiers returned to a country that had been remade by scarcity, political conflict, and mournful absence, and they encountered a society in which authority had been contested and many questions remained unanswered. The transition from empire to republic was messy and contested, baptized in both celebration and bitterness as the populace grappled with what victory or defeat meant in human terms. The cessation of hostilities did not instantly heal wounds, rather, it shifted their expression into politics, memory, and national identity. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, codified terms that many Germans experienced as humiliation and betrayal, and that sense of grievance would echo through the interwar years. Territorial losses, disarmament clauses, and financial reparations were framed by Allies as necessary to prevent future aggression, but Germans saw them as punitive and debilitating. Political leaders inside the country argued bitterly about blame and responsibility, and the social atmosphere fertilized myths and resentments that opportunists would later exploit. The treaty's consequences were neither simple nor inevitable, yet its imprint on the national consciousness was unmistakable and enduring. The cultural and artistic response to the war within Germany was varied, ranging from stoic memorialization to bitter critique, and artists sought ways to express loss, absurdity, and dislocation. Poets wrote elegies for young men who had been extinguished, filmmakers experimented with new forms to capture trauma, and painters rendered landscapes altered by shelling and decay. The war thus became a subject for reflection and reevaluation, generating works that questioned previous assumptions about progress, honor, and the costs of national ambition. Memory was not uniform, and different communities and creators preserved different aspects of the experience in ways that shaped later generations' understanding. The fate of veterans after the war raised profound social and political challenges, for men who had been trained to obey orders often returned to a society that needed new forms of integration and support. Many bore invisible wounds, shock, guilt, and the sense of having been betrayed by command or nation, and unemployment and disability compounded those psychic injuries. Associations of former soldiers mobilized for rights and recognition, sometimes leaning toward conservative or nationalist politics, and their presence became a potent force in post-war public life. The manipulation of veteran identity by political movements contributed to a climate of polarization and grievance that the Republic struggled to contain. Governance in the post-war period involved wrestling with economic collapse, hyperinflation, and political violence, and the Weimar Republic's fragile democratic experiment faced near-constant stress. Competing visions of Germany's future, monarchist restoration, socialist transformation, or nationalist revival, collided in elections, street fights, and attempted coups. Public faith in institutions wavered as everyday life became a sequence of crises, and the experience of wartime upheaval became a precursor for the challenges the Republic would face. Even as people sought stability, the scars of war shaped political decisions and cultural moods in ways that were complex and often contradictory. Hundreds of memorials and cemeteries across Europe bear witness to the human cost of the Great War and the German Empire's participation in it, and these sites became spaces of grieving, memory, and sometimes politicization. Men and women visited graves and monuments seeking closure, and movements surrounding remembrance rituals sought to define the meaning of sacrifice. Over time, commemorative practices revealed how different groups narrated the past, as noble dedication, tragic waste, or a lesson in hubris. The struggle over memory would continue to influence literature, education, and politics, ensuring that the past remained an active presence in public life. The Great War also accelerated changes in technology, medicine, and social organization that had long-term effects, and Germany's scientific and engineering communities both contributed to and were transformed by wartime innovation. Advances made under the pressure of survival, in fields from chemistry to aeronautics, found civilian applications after the conflict, altering industry and everyday life in unpredictable ways. Yet those same innovations also created ethical debates about the relationship between science and war, about how knowledge could be used to heal or to harm. The intellectual legacy of the conflict thus entwined progress with moral ambivalence. The question of responsibility for the outbreak and conduct of the war remains a subject of historical inquiry and ethical debate, and German actions are examined in light of diplomacy, miscalculation, and national psychology. Historians have argued over the balance between structural forces and individual choices, and analyses continue to shift as new evidence and perspectives emerge. Understanding the German Empire's role involves weighing the intentions of leaders, the pressures of alliance commitments, and the unpredictable dynamics of mass mobilization. The complexity of these factors resists simplistic verdicts and invites careful reflection on how nations decide to fight. Stories from the front lines, the factories, and the family homes accumulate into a larger narrative about what war does to persons and polities. And the German case provides a particularly stark illustration because its transformation was so total. From unification to empire, and from relative peace to global war, the arc shows how rapid modernization can create capabilities that outpace political imagination. Glory, in this context, often arrived hand in hand with tragedy. The same forces that produced national pride also produced loss on an immense scale. Listening to those layers of experience helps us grasp how deeply war reshaped social bonds and moral horizons. The literature and testimony produced in later decades continue to engage with the complexities of the empire at war, and writers and historians revisited episodes in search of meaning and responsibility. Memoirs, novels, and scholarly works mixed personal recollection with documentary research, arguing that the past could be understood only through both evidence and empathy. As new generations read these accounts, they encountered both the grandeur of ambition and the intimate cost of conflict, learning that narratives of heroism are often braided with grief. This ongoing conversation about memory and interpretation has kept the subject alive and relevant to political debates and ethical considerations. As the 20th century unfolded, the lessons drawn from the German Empire's wartime experience became part of broader debates about militarism, democracy, and international order, and policymakers looked for ways to prevent such catastrophes from recurring. Institutions like the League of Nations and later the United Nations were imagined as antidotes to the unilateral violence that had consumed Europe, though they themselves would face tests and subsequent crises. The German case informed arguments about arms control, diplomacy, and collective security, even as it also warned of the perils of punitive peace settlements and social disintegration. Those debates reminded the world that preventing war requires not only treaties but sustained attention to justice and economic stability. The human dimension of loss extended beyond borders, for millions of refugees, displaced families, and orphaned children scattered across Europe in the war's aftermath, and the German Empire's collapse contributed to that vast humanitarian crisis. Aid organizations formed to provide food, shelter, and medicine, and the scale of suffering prompted new approaches to international relief and social welfare. The reconstruction of lives, towns, and economies would take years if not decades, and the need for international cooperation became plain in both moral and practical terms. Rebuilding was not simply a technical process, it also demanded healing of relationships frayed by years of conflict and suspicion. Examining the soldiers' diaries and the letters from home reveals ordinary people trying to make sense of extraordinary events, and these documents provide a raw, immediate sense of how individuals coped with fear, boredom, and responsibility. Some found solace in faith or routine, others in small acts of kindness and humor, and many struggled with the cognitive dissonance between the ideals that had sent them to war and the bloody realities they encountered. Those private records remind us that history is enacted not only by states and generals but by countless small decisions and acts of endurance, compassion, and survival. The war's moral landscape was inhabited at street level, and those human choices shaped outcomes as surely as strategy did. In subsequent decades, the memory of the German Empire at war would be invoked by political movements seeking legitimacy, and the past could be pressed into the service of competing visions for the nation's future. Veterans organizations and nationalist groups sometimes used remembrance to demand political change, while others sought to honor sacrifice without endorsing aggressive policies. The malleability of memory meant that the same events could be framed as evidence of heroism or as a cautionary tale about militarism and imperial ambition. This contest over meaning underlined how history can be a battleground where interpretations matter for present politics. Finally, the story of the German Empire in war is not a simple moral of villainy or virtue, it is a human portrait of ambition, courage, error, and loss that resists easy categorization. The empire achieved industrial and cultural feats that commanded respect, yet its wartime policies and the suffering they caused demand accountability and reflection. To listen to these histories is to accept complexity, to admire ingenuity and mourn devastation, to recognize the pressures leaders faced and the responsibilities they bore, to remember the faces of those who fought and those who waited. Such careful listening helps us understand not only what happened, but how to carry the lessons forward so that future generations may choose differently. The last months of the German Empire unfolded like a long, slow unraveling, the threads of authority thinning under the weight of war, hunger, and a people's exhaustion. What had once seemed permanent, the uniforms, the salutes, the imperial court, began to feel fragile, a set of rituals that no longer matched the lives they were supposed to hold together. In factories and barracks, in the streets and at the dining tables of the working poor, the mood shifted from dutiful endurance to urgent, impatient restlessness. War had hollowed out daily life long before the final surrender. For 4 years, the front had mortgaged the nation's future, food convoys diverted to feed soldiers, raw materials shipped to ammunition plants, young men bled dry in trenches. Those at home watched their children grow up thin and older than their years, watched their sisters and mothers step into factories and take up new habits and new hopes. The strain left a society that no longer trusted the old certainties to supply its needs or to justify their sacrifices. Behind the scenes, the German high command bore its own fatigue and outrage, but not of the kind that breeds political reform. Instead, it harbored resentment at failure, at the slow collapse of a strategy that had once promised decisive victory. Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who had fashioned the military tempo of the Reich, found themselves forced into a bitter calculus. To avoid blame, they needed political change at home that could be pointed to as evidence the nation had not been defeated solely by military misfortune. That calculation would shape the endgame. The idea that Germany could negotiate a better peace if it presented a civilian government to the Allies fed directly into the collapse. Allied powers, and above all Woodrow Wilson with his emphasis on democracy, insisted that Germany demonstrate democratic credentials to secure a favorable armistice. Suddenly, constitutional reform, once a distant academic argument, became a bargaining chip. The result was a hurried, sometimes cynical, conversion of power away from the Kaiser and into the hands of party leaders who had long been sidelined. On the ground, the story was smaller and more chaotic. Sailors in the Baltic Fleet, ordered to conduct a last, likely suicidal sortie in October 1918, refused the command. What began as quiet resistance in the barracks quickly spread. News of mutiny traveled by trusted word rather than by official channels, and the mutinies ignited a wave of demonstrations and council meetings from Kiel to Wilhelmshaven. Ordinary soldiers and seamen, exhausted and radicalized, became the spark that ignited a larger revolutionary flame. Kiel became the emblem of the falling order, its docks a theater where sailors, often only teenagers, stood up to captains and officers who had seemed unassailable. They set up councils, elected delegates, and called for an end to the war and the overthrow of the monarchy. When workers' and soldiers' councils began to appear in towns and cities across Germany, the movement had a pattern: spontaneous, self-organized bodies claiming to speak for the people and to coordinate demands for bread, peace, and power. This council movement carried echoes of other revolutions, including Russia's, but it was also unmistakably German in its texture. It reflected regional grievances, industrial grievances, and a hunger for dignified participation in public life. In the factories that had once produced uniforms and shell casings, workers now debated factory committees and workplace democracy with the intensity of people who had nothing left to lose. Across class lines, hierarchies dissolved, at least for the moment, into the simple arithmetic of need and anger. For the political center, the sudden rise of councils posed a terrifying choice. Moderate Social Democrats, already represented in the Reichstag but alarmed by revolution's radical impulse, feared a breakdown into chaos. Conservative elites and the military feared the loss of property, order, and hierarchy. Between these forces stood men like Friedrich Ebert, who saw in compromise the only route to salvage something of the nation's stability. The compromise he sought in those crucial weeks would have profound consequences. On November 9, 1918, the ancient political order yielded its most visible symbol. In Berlin, the proclamation of a republic was shouted into a city already thick with rumor and celebration, and the Kaiser, confronted with the inevitability of abdication, fled to the Netherlands. The spectacle seemed abrupt, almost theatrical, but it had been months in the making. The throne, once absolute in its aura, had been stripped of legitimacy by failure abroad and deprivation at home. Yet the fall of the monarch did not mean the end of elites, nor did it satisfy the most radical demands. A conservative civil service remained in place, as did a military establishment that had no intention of disappearing. Industrialists and landowners worried less about the loss of royal pageantry than about the protection of their factories, estates, and capital. In the months after the monarchy's collapse, political power was contested not only on grand stages but in offices and corridors where bargaining would decide how much of the old order would survive in a new legal form. As the armistice negotiations proceeded, details of surrender and disarmament became urgent matters that shaped domestic politics. The decision to accept the Allied terms was taken by a civilian government that had little time to consult the populace. For many Germans, the armistice felt like a national humiliation, a surrender imposed by foreign hands and mediated by politicians who had little to say in their own defense. That resentment would take many forms, including a myth of stab in the back that would later have lethal consequences. The sunlight of November did not warm all hearts. In city squares, where crowds gathered to celebrate the end of war, there were also darker conversations about justice, retribution, and the creation of a new society. Some wanted immediate, sweeping nationalization of industry and agrarian reform. Others sought modest extensions of the franchise and social insurance. There was fervor and impatience in equal measure, and the political institutions that now had to handle those demands were inexperienced and precarious. The Social Democratic Party, which had long been Germany's largest labor party, found itself caught between its revolutionary base and its commitment to parliamentary methods. The party split between a moderate wing that accepted compromise to preserve order and a radical wing influenced by revolutionary Marxism that wanted a complete overthrow of capitalism. This division produced an organizational and moral dilemma. Could the SPD lead a peaceful transition without betraying the expectations of the masses that had risen in their name? Simultaneously, in the cramped cells of revolutionary activity, new leaders emerged who would go down in history for both their courage and their tragedy. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, passionate and uncompromising, called for a council-based republic that would dismantle the military and the capitalist structures that had run the war. Their words linked with the grievances of workers, and their presence lent a moral urgency to something that otherwise might have remained a series of administrative reforms. January 1919 brought the Spartacist uprising, a brief and brutal attempt by the radical left to take power in Berlin. The uprising grew out of months of accumulated tension, a fragile government, demobilized soldiers with guns, and a left emboldened by successes elsewhere. It did not succeed. The government, which feared a descent into civil war, made an alliance of convenience with right-wing units known as Freikorps to beat back the insurgents. That alliance would stain the new republic with blood and set a pattern of using paramilitary force to resolve political questions. The murders of Liebknecht and Luxemburg after the suppression of the Spartacists were a shocking punctuation to the revolution's open moments. Their extrajudicial killings by elements within the Freikorps robbed the movement of two of its most important voices and signaled how violently the old order could strike back. For many on the left, their deaths confirmed the worst suspicions about the new government's willingness to repress dissent to maintain stability. The moral ruptures of those days would echo through the political culture of the Weimar years. Beyond Berlin, Bavaria became a laboratory for radical experiment. In Munich, the monarchy collapsed into a brief, idealistic attempt to create a socialist republic that would reorganize society from the ground up. Artists, intellectuals, and workers attempted to build a new kind of polity, one that aligned creative freedom with social justice. But the Bavarian experiment, like others, was isolated and vulnerable, lacking the institutional support and the resources needed to survive against a hostile center and determined reactionaries. Meanwhile, the new national government faced the Herculean task of drawing up a constitution and organizing elections while the economy teetered on collapse. Food shortages persisted, veterans returned to find no jobs waiting for them, influenza ravaged communities. The Constituent Assembly met in Weimar for practical and symbolic reasons. The city offered a peaceful setting away from the volatile streets of Berlin and a connection to Germany's cultural heritage. There, politicians sought to sculpt a legal framework that would reconcile liberty and order in a nation unaccustomed to representative democracy. The Weimar Constitution was a compromise crafted under pressure. It created a president with significant powers, a chancellor accountable to the parliament, and protections for civil liberties. At the same time, it preserved aspects of centralized power and left room for emergency measures that future leaders could exploit. The document reflected the urgent need for stability more than a full celebration of democratic pluralism, and its built-in tensions would complicate the republic's ability to weather crises. Economic hardship proved a relentless underminer of political legitimacy. War indemnities, loss of territories, and the disruption of trade and industry left the economy fragile. Inflation, which only later spiraled into hyperinflation, began to eat at savings and to deepen class resentments. For ordinary citizens, the promise of a better life after the fall of the monarchy felt slow to arrive. For veterans and the dispossessed, bitterness became a political toxin. Social changes also rippled through everyday life. Women, who had taken on work during the war, gained wider social roles and, by 1919, the federal vote. That expansion of citizenship widened democratic participation but also unsettled those who associated traditional gender roles with social stability. Cultural life, meanwhile, experienced an outpouring of innovation. Theater, literature, and the visual arts exploded in experimental forms, reflecting both disillusionment and liberation. The cultural ferment of the post-war years presaged a society in flux, seeking new languages to speak its anxieties. But forms of continuity persisted under the surface. Elements of the Junker class, the traditional Prussian landowning elites, retained influence in local politics and in the military hierarchy. Industrial leaders continued to control capital and production, and they often found allies in politicians who prioritized order over wide-ranging social reform. Where revolutionary rhetoric had promised sweeping change, practical realities and entrenched interests conspired to limit transformation. The military itself underwent a tortured institutional reorientation. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed strict limits on Germany's armed forces and demanded disarmament that many in Germany considered humiliating. Officers and rank-and-file soldiers resented the treaty and feared the consequences of disarmament for national security and their own status. The result was a shadowy persistence of military culture in paramilitary formations and silent resistance to Versailles, and in political conversations that framed the treaty as a national indignity rather than a legal settlement. The treaty also carried with it the seeds of a new kind of grievance politics. The reparations and territorial losses required official acceptance and public explanation at a time when many Germans found such concessions unconscionable. Politicians who had overseen the surrender were painted as traitors in popular myth, and that narrative proved useful for those who wished to delegitimize parliamentary democracy. The emotional power of that myth would be harnessed by parties and movements seeking to overturn the new order. Across the cultural landscape, a sense of dislocation informed art, philosophy, and public discourse. Writers and intellectuals interrogated the moral responsibility of the nation for the war, pondering guilt and complicity. Public mourning for the dead met with a desire to find meaning in loss, leading to memorials, literature, and political movements that sought to shape memory for present aims. Memory itself became a contested terrain, with rival narratives vying to define who had been sacrificed and why. For ordinary citizens, the day-to-day politics of the revolution and its aftermath were often less about grand theory than about immediate survival. Where to buy bread, how to find work, and whether your son would return from the front dominated decisions. Local councils and municipal governments bore the brunt of governance, improvising solutions for rationing, housing, and public health. In this granular governance, the fate of the broader revolution was often quietly decided through compromise, negotiation, or neglect. As years passed, the euphoria and fear of 1918 faded into routine, but the structural weaknesses remained. The Weimar Republic stabilized in fits and starts, sometimes showing remarkable cultural vivacity and moments of social progress, and sometimes revealing crippling political fragmentation. Electoral politics produced coalition governments that often struggled to enact decisive policy, leaving citizens to feel that democracy was cumbersome and ineffective in times of crisis. Paramilitary culture, however, remained dangerously alive. Freikorps units, having been used to suppress leftist uprisings, did not disband quietly. They became a pool of disaffected, armed men available to the highest bidder. These groups varied in motive and composition, but many were animated by nationalist resentment and a willingness to use violence in the name of order. Their existence normalized political violence in a way that later demagogues could exploit. One of the bitter ironies of the revolution's end was that the compromise intended to prevent total upheaval effectively alienated both extremes. Radical socialists felt betrayed by the SPD's willingness to use force to maintain order, while conservatives and nationalists felt that the Republic had sold out to foreign interests and to unbecoming levels of social democracy. That mutual alienation reduced the space for moderate consensus and made the political center a precarious place to stand. Internationally, Germany's humiliation shaped a sense of grievance that would not easily be assuaged. The diplomatic isolation and economic burden imposed by the Versailles regime were presented by nationalists as evidence that the country had been singled out for punishment. For many citizens, the humiliation was personal as well as political. Soldiers who had fought on the front, veterans who had seen comrades die, and families who had suffered loss all felt that their sacrifice had been betrayed at the negotiating table. Yet to focus only on grievance obscures the complex, often painful reform that also occurred. The Republic introduced social legislation that extended unemployment insurance, expanded access to education, and protected workers in ways that the old imperial system had not. These measures had real impact on the lives of many citizens, even as they were contested politically. The revolution's legacy, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single narrative of failure. It was simultaneously a vehicle of pain and of promise. The cultural renaissance of the 1920s, emerging from the same soil as political instability, offered a different kind of response to the collapse of the old order. Cabarets, theaters, and periodicals became forums for satirical and experimental takes on public life. Modernist artists challenged conventional aesthetics and social mores, inventing forms that matched the fractured sensibility of a society in transition. This artistic energy was not merely escapist, it was a public reckoning with the trauma of war and the dislocations of revolution. Across the cities and the countryside, the revolution encouraged new forms of civic engagement. Unions grew more organized, cooperative movements sprouted in rural areas, and local councils experimented with participatory governance. For many people, the period offered the first real chance to have a voice in public affairs. Those seeds of civic participation would bear fruit unevenly, sometimes bolstering democratic life, other times being co-opted by powerful factions. Yet the political landscape also grew more volatile as parties on the extremes refined their tactics. Right-wing nationalists developed propaganda machines that exploited economic fear and social discontent, while the far left remained fragmented and often unable to forge a broad coalition. The democratic center was squeezed between these pressures, and the alliances necessary for stable governance proved fragile in the face of economic shocks and political violence. The culture of blame for the defeat and the subsequent settlement became a potent political weapon. Narratives that cast the Republic as illegitimate were spread through newspapers, speeches, and, later, radio. They depicted the Republic as the creation of November criminals rather than as a necessary adaptation to the realities of military defeat and international pressure. That delegitimization made it easier for anti-democratic movements to gain traction among those who felt betrayed by elites and left behind by change. Political assassination and street violence, though not constant, became a disturbing feature of the era. Political murderers were often never fully prosecuted, and the atmosphere of impunity fostered the sense that politics could be settled by bullets rather than ballots. Such normalization of violence corroded public trust and hardened political identities, making compromise more difficult and confrontation more likely. One must also note the role of provincialities in this national drama. Germany was not a monolith. Regional differences in culture, economy, and tradition meant that the revolution looked very different in different places. Prussia, with its conservative militaristic traditions, resisted republican reform more stubbornly than industrialized regions like the Ruhr. Southern and eastern provinces had distinct social compositions that produced varied political outcomes. Understanding the collapse of the old order requires hearing these many local voices and seeing how the national narrative was assembled from their disparate experiences. Education and the press played a critical role in shaping political imagination. Newspapers, from socialist dailies to conservative weeklies, contested the facts of the day and offered competing interpretations of events. Literacy was rising, and with it the capacity of citizens to form political views informed by print culture. That expansion of information made public opinion a more forceful component of political legitimacy, but also made rumor and sensationalism more dangerous. The experience of demobilized soldiers deserves particular attention. Returning veterans, often physically and psychologically scarred, faced a labor market that could not absorb them. The state's attempts to reintegrate them were uneven and sometimes punitive, deepening a sense of betrayal. Veterans associations formed, carrying with them a mix of camaraderie, bitterness, and political aspirations that various parties sought to harness. This was not a single cohort with a single political destiny, but their presence as an organized social force had outsized influence. Religious communities, too, navigated the tumult in complex ways. Churches and religious organizations provided social support, moral counsel, and charitable assistance in a time of dire need, even as their institutional authority had been diminished by war and modernity. Some religious leaders supported the Republic as a balm against disorder, while others aligned with conservative or nationalist forces that promised traditional values. Religion, in short, was neither a simple anchor nor an automatic ally to any side. It was another terrain of negotiation. Among the many formal institutions that shaped outcomes, the judiciary played a subtle but consequential role. Courts that had in the imperial era supported property and elite prerogatives had to adapt to a new constitutional order that emphasized civil rights. Yet judicial culture was not transformed overnight, and legal interpretations often reflected lingering conservative sympathies. Laws and legal practices thus became another axis along which continuity and change collided. Technological changes also influenced social and political life. Railways and telegraphs, which had defined the logistical experience of war, continued to knit the country together in peacetime, enabling both economic recovery and the rapid dissemination of political messages. The expansion of mass media, newspapers and theaters, then cinema, meant that political events could be staged and circulated in new ways, shaping national moods quickly and powerfully. These technologies amplified both democratic engagement and demagogic persuasion. The foreign context, too, cannot be overlooked. The early 1920s were a period of shifting alliances, economic pressure, and diplomatic contest. Neighboring countries eyed Germany with suspicion and strategic concern, while exiled German monarchs and émigré communities plotted or prayed for restoration in various corners of Europe. International politics constrained the options available to the new government, limiting the room for domestic experimentation and sometimes encouraging short-term compromises that would have long-term costs. Financial instability fed political instability. Reparations payments strained the treasury and constrained public spending, forcing the state into austerity measures that left social programs underfunded. Debates over how to meet reparations and how to reorganize the economy became central to public policy and political identity. These disagreements were not purely technical, they were moral arguments about responsibility, sacrifice, and the future shape of society. Labor movements gained and lost power in the tumult. On the one hand, unions secured gains in wages and conditions during moments of scarcity and upheaval. On the other hand, divisions within the labor movement, between those willing to accept bourgeois institutions and those demanding more radical change, undermined their collective effectiveness over time. Labor's role in the revolution was double-edged, essential in toppling the old order, yet vulnerable to co-optation and repression as politics became more polarized. The collapse of the old order also meant a collapse of the old myths. The image of Germany as an invincible imperial power was shattered, compelling citizens to recast national identity around new foundations. Some chose to resurrect an aggressive nationalism in response, seeking to reclaim lost honor, while others gravitated toward cosmopolitanism, social democracy, or pacifism. The nation's identity, once anchored in monarchy and militarism, became a question to be argued and fought over in the public square. In education and youth culture, the revolution opened spaces for experimentation. New youth movements emphasized social responsibility, outdoor life, and a break from militarized training. Schools, where they could, adapted curricula to democratic principles and civic education. These shifts were tentative and uneven but signaled a generational reorientation toward different conceptions of citizenship. The Republic's legal and bureaucratic reforms, while often incremental, created the scaffolding for modern governance. Civil service reforms, labor protections, and a more open press contributed to the development of institutions that, properly tended, could nurture democratic culture. The challenge was that these reforms had to compete with unpaid wartime debts, social resentments, and a politics prone to polarization. Building durable institutions takes time and patience, luxuries the new republic did not always possess. Imperfect as they were, the efforts at reform did yield a flourishing of intellectual life. Universities reopened to critical inquiry, public debates flourished, and a new generation of thinkers sought to make sense of the catastrophe of war and the fragile hope of democracy. The period saw intense philosophical engagement with questions of responsibility, authority, and the meaning of modernity. Intellectual work, in turn, fed activism, policy experiments, and the cultural life of cities across Germany. As the mid-1920s approached, there were moments of apparent normalization when the Republic seemed to stabilize and even prosper. Yet these periods of calm often masked deeper fault lines. Economic upswings were fragile, dependent on foreign loans, and vulnerable to global shocks. Political coalitions were brittle, and public faith in democratic institutions remained contingent rather than rooted. The revolution's promise of a new order, then, remained only partially realized. The persistence of radicalism on both the left and the right meant that German politics continued to be a battlefield of ideas and of force. Each side learned from the early experience of the Republic. The right refined techniques of propaganda and organization, while the left struggled with unity and strategy. The paradox was that the very compromises made to avoid civil war in 1918 to 1919 helped create the conditions for the continued contestation that would define the Republic's precarious life. Family life and private worlds carried on amidst political turbulence. Weddings, births, and ordinary domestic routines persisted even when memorials were being erected and orators spoke of revolution. In kitchens and at neighborhood shops, people negotiated the costs of the new political reality, who to trust, which politicians could be relied upon, and how to keep families fed. These private negotiations fed the public mood, for political legitimacy is ultimately grounded in the felt experiences of daily life. As years passed, histories of the revolution were written and rewritten, each telling emphasizing different heroes and villains. Memory politics became part of the struggle over national identity, with monuments, schoolbooks, and public commemorations offering competing narratives. Those who controlled the narrative could influence how future generations understood the causes of collapse and the moral contours of responsibility. Memory, therefore, was not merely retrospective but a present political tool. One must not forget the everyday acts of courage and generosity that marked the period. Neighbors shared food, volunteers tended the sick during influenza epidemics, and local leaders improvised shelters and services for those in need. These acts were not always recorded in grand histories, but they sustained communities and kept social fabric from tearing entirely. In a time of upheaval, such small moral gestures often mattered most. The collapse of the old order in Germany was not a single moment but a complex process. It involved the rupture of institutions, the recalibration of political identities, cultural reinvention, and the painful adjustment to international humiliation. It was shaped by choices both strategic and impulsive, by acts of courage and acts of cruelty, by compromise and betrayal. To understand it fully is to hold a kaleidoscope of human motives and historical pressures in tension. Looking back, the revolution's immediate outcome was ambiguous. Monarchy was dissolved, and parliamentary institutions took root, but the fragile republic that emerged was burdened with contradictions. The seeds of future conflict were present: economic grievance, a culture of political violence, and a politics of myth and blame. Yet the era also produced democratic innovations, social reforms, and a cultural vibrancy that suggested alternatives to the old imperial order. History, finally, resists tidy moral lessons. The fall of the Reich teaches both the dangers of entrenched authority that refuses accountability and the hazards of transitions managed without broad legitimacy. It shows how compromise can be necessary for peace and how the use of force to secure compromise can poison democratic prospects. It teaches that the health of a republic depends not merely on documents and elections, but on the patience and goodwill of citizens and elites alike. In the quiet moments, long after the cheers and the gunfire, Germans asked themselves how a proud empire had been so thoroughly undone. The answers were many: military collapse, economic exhaustion, diplomatic isolation, social upheaval, and political miscalculation. But the human story, of individuals making desperate choices, of neighbors helping neighbors, of leaders balancing fear against hope, remains at the heart of the narrative. The collapse of the old order thus stands as a cautionary tale and a source of insight. It reveals how political systems can disintegrate when they fail to meet basic human needs, how myths of betrayal can be weaponized, and how fragile the institutions of democracy can be when built under the shadow of defeat. Yet it also demonstrates the tenacity of civic imagination and the capacity for cultural renewal in the wake of catastrophe. As an ending is never final in history, the fall of the Reich continued to reverberate far beyond 1919. Political movements formed in reaction to the revolution would reshape Europe in the decades to come. The lessons, both salutary and alarming, would be invoked by those seeking power and by those defending democratic values. The story of 1918 to 1919 thus remained a living part of the nation's memory and of the world's understanding of revolutions and the fragile work of building stable, inclusive political orders. The story of the German Empire begins in an assembly hall heavy with coats of arms and the sharp smell of coal smoke, when kings and chancellors stitched together a nation that had been more idea than state. It was an empire forged by soldiers and statesmen, by the clatter of rifle butts and the low, relentless logic of railroads. Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, understood power as a craft to be wrought in secret appointments and public victories, and he shaped the political architecture around monarchy, federalism, and a pragmatic social policy meant to blunt the edges of unrest. That first chapter set a rhythm for Germany, a rhythm of industry, order, and an appetite for influence that would echo for generations. Across sweeping plains and in narrow mountain valleys, the new empire changed the lives of ordinary people in ways both immediate and subtle. In the factories of the Ruhr, 1,000 hands learned a new language of gears and pressure, and the city nights began to glow with gas and electric arc. Farmers, meanwhile, adjusted to modern markets, turning from subsistence to cash crops to feed a growing urban population. Small towns felt the same pulse. A town square could become a place of social insurance offices, volunteer fire brigades, and men in new uniformed organizations, all symbols of a state that was approaching every corner of life. Industry did not grow in isolation. It brought with it a culture of measurement, of laboratories and laboratory silence where experiments told you how the world bent. Chemists and physicists in German universities and technical schools made breakthroughs that reached the household and the battlefield alike, inventing dyes and explosives, refining steel, unspooling the invisible threads of electricity. Universities became engines of both imagination and armament, producing Nobel laureates with the same steady patience that produced engineers for the factories. This union of intellect and production created a society that prized technical mastery and rewarded precision, and it altered the global map of power as well as the kitchen tables inside German homes. Power on that global map meant colonies, and the empire reached outward with a confidence that was, in equal measure, curiosity and arrogance. German flags rose on coasts in Africa and islands in the Pacific, places where traders, missionaries, and soldiers encountered climates and cultures unlike anything they had known. Those encounters were far from benign. Colonial administration carried with it harsh discipline, economic extraction, and policies that inflicted deep suffering on indigenous peoples. The violence of those years has long shadowed the empire's legacy. And speaking of the period means listening to the voices of those who endured it and acknowledging wrongs that are still part of the conversation about restitution and memory. Back inside the empire, the political landscape was a constant negotiation between an emperor, princes of several German states, and a Reichstag elected by male citizens. The legislature could legislate, but not reign. The Kaiser remained an ever-present symbol of unity and authority. Bismarck's social legislation, pensions, health insurance, accident insurance, was both an act of statecraft and a recognition that a modern state must address the needs of its people to survive. These laws bound workers to the state and created institutions that, in different forms, would survive the tumult of the 20th century. Yet stability was never absolute. Industrialization created class tensions that were both political and personal. Factory women and men faced long hours and dangerous conditions, and political movements emerged to challenge the new order. Social democracy gathered support among workers and intellectuals alike, and its rise forced conservative elites to reckon with a broad demand for rights and recognition. Those struggles shaped a modern politics in which mass parties, organized labor, and an increasingly literate press all became fixtures of public life. Alongside political maneuvering, cultural life flourished in a way that sometimes contradicted the stern image of a disciplined nation. Cities hummed with theaters, cabarets, and cafes where poets and critics argued into the night. Artists pushed against academic restraints and sought forms that could express the anxieties and exhilarations of modern life. Literature, music, and painting during the imperial era were not mere embellishments, they were the mirror in which a society inspected itself, quarrels and all. Religion, too, was a battlefield for identity. The Kulturkampf, Bismarck's campaign to limit the political power of the Catholic Church revealed how contentious the relationship between church and state could be. With it came debates that reached into classrooms and into the way communities ordered private life. At the same time, Protestantism and Catholicism both contributed to a moral imagination that was woven into national ceremonies and everyday practice, shaping how people understood duty and belonging. Education became a central thread in building the empire's future. Primary schools spread literacy at a rate that changed the texture of public debate and made newspapers and pamphlets a shared medium. Secondary schools and universities systematized learning, producing an elite conversant in law, science, and the classics. The pedagogy emphasized discipline and citizenship, but it also nurtured minds that would question, redesign, and sometimes deplore the very system that educated them. Military culture was another defining element, omnipresent in parades, in conscription, and in the reverence for officers who embodied an ideal of service. Military efficiency shaped public life and private expectations, and uniforms became a marker of identity for a nation that had been united under banners and cannons. Service meant more than defense. It was a rite of passage and a shorthand for belonging, and this sentiment fed into the empire's outward ambitions. The military's prestige affected political choices, budgets, and the very imagination of what it meant to be German. As the empire matured, the press expanded and public discourse grew more complex. Newspapers and pamphlets spread political ideas fast, and satire found its way into both humor and serious critique. The expansion of literacy and the circulation of printed material meant that gossip and high politics could intersect in the same column, shaping public perceptions and stirring passions. A politically engaged public did not always mean a deliberative one. The press could inflame as much as it could inform, and the culture of argument sometimes tipped into polarization. Economically, the empire transformed from a patchwork of regional markets to an industrial powerhouse that competed with Britain and the United States. Steel and coal, chemicals and rail created wealth that underwrote both pensions and armaments. Banking and credit systems evolved to meet the needs of industry, and corporate conglomerates began to shape national priorities. Yet rapid growth also introduced vulnerabilities, dependence on raw materials, imbalances between regions, and social dislocations that political institutions struggled to manage. Cities themselves became laboratories of modernity, where new technologies altered the pace and texture of life. Streetcars, gas lights, telephones, and urban planning remade how people moved through their days. The smell of coal in one neighborhood and the scent of horse stalls in another marked a changing environment, and municipal governance responded with sanitation projects, housing codes, and cultural amenities meant to promote order and civic pride. Urban life was messy and vibrant, and it produced a cultural pluralism that would later inform the republics that followed. Transportation technology, railroads, steamships, telegraphs, knitted the empire together and connected it to the world. Trains carried not only goods but ideas, and schedule boards and train stations read like calendars of the modern age. The telegraph and telephone shortened distances, making business and diplomacy faster and more immediate than before. This infrastructure was the literal backbone of an empire that wanted to move people, products, and messages quickly and efficiently. The imperial courts, with their rituals and pageantry, cultivated a sense of grandeur and continuity. Palace facades, military reviews, and ornamental uniforms created an aesthetic that suggested permanence. Yet beneath the surface, tensions between regional identities and a centralizing monarchy persisted. The empire was a federal organism whose unity depended on delicate negotiations with princes, and those arrangements produced compromises that shaped governance and local loyalties. Everyday life in the late imperial home was a mixture of tradition and innovation. Kitchens acquired new cookware and techniques, while servant hierarchies persisted in many middle-class homes. The role of women shifted incrementally. More women entered the workforce or engaged in social reform movements, but legal and cultural constraints limited their public power. Domestic spaces became havens and arenas, and what happened within them often reflected the larger social transformations at play. Public health, once a peripheral concern, became a central responsibility of the modern state in the empire's era. Sanitation projects, vaccine campaigns, and hospital construction sought to tame once common diseases and reduce infant mortality. These efforts were often uneven, and rural areas did not always benefit as quickly as cities, but the commitment to public health indicated a changing relationship between citizens and the state. Health became a metric of national strength and a moral obligation to future generations. Science and technology not only produced wealth but also shaped national narrative. The empire prized its laboratories, observatories, and academies as sources of prestige. Scientific societies and industrial research became intertwined, advancing knowledge that had both humanistic and utilitarian consequences. The authority of science shaped public debates and gave the state new tools for governance, as well as new responsibilities and ethical dilemmas. Language and law helped to consolidate a sense of nationhood. Standardizing educational curricula, legal codes, and bureaucratic procedures made administration more uniform and predictable, and they created the sense that belonging to the empire involved shared norms and rights. Yet linguistic diversity remained in border regions and among immigrant communities, reminding the polity of its plural character. Law and language were instruments of unity, but they were also battlegrounds where identity was negotiated and sometimes contested. The arts during the imperial era were both a refuge and a provocation. Composers, playwrights, and novelists experimented with forms that reflected the anxieties of modern life, alienation, industrialization, and the clash between tradition and innovation. Some works celebrated national myths, while others exposed the fractures beneath them. The tension between art that reinforced collective identity and art that questioned it created a cultural landscape rich in contradiction and deep in reflection. National ceremonies and monuments articulated a particular memory of the past, selecting heroes and events that would form a collective story. Statues of statesmen and generals populated public squares, and museums curated narratives of progress and unity. These symbols could unite, but they also simplified complex histories and sometimes erased uncomfortable truths. Memory, in this sense, was an active process. Citizens and officials made choices about what to remember and what to forget. The empire's legal and bureaucratic systems left behind a legacy that modern Germany would inherit in both form and function. Civil service norms, administrative boundaries, and legal concepts persisted beyond the empire's fall, shaping institutions in the Weimar Republic and even into the federal republics that followed. Continuities provided stability, but they also meant that problematic elements, militarism, hierarchical deference, did not vanish overnight. The struggle to reform and democratize institutions was an ongoing project across successive regimes. Social welfare, initiated under Bismarck as a tool of statecraft, became part of a longer conversation about social responsibility. The idea that the state should protect workers from the worst of industrial hazards gained traction and created programs that endured and altered forms through later governments. Welfare measures were both practical and symbolic, acknowledging the dignity of labor and the interconnectedness of society. These systems shaped expectations about citizenship and the social contract in ways that outlasted imperial slogans. Political parties became more sophisticated and mass-oriented during the empire, forging ideologies and organizational capacities that would carry into the 20th century. Conservatives, liberals, socialists, and others developed distinct worlds of discourse and networks of support. Elections and party politics made governance a public spectacle and taught citizens the mechanics of representation and pressure. Political mobilization, once limited to elites, became a national habit that shaped civic life. Labor movements, trade unions, and socialist organizations pushed the question of rights into everyday political life, asserting the dignity of the working class and demanding institutional protections. Strikes and negotiations created new precedents in labor relations, and the state's response ranged from repression to concession. These struggles shaped how later governments would balance economic development with social justice, influencing the contours of modern welfare states across Europe. The empire's foreign policy oscillated between careful diplomacy and ambitious assertiveness. Bismarck's alliances sought to isolate threats and maintain balance, but his successors pursued a more assertive posture that sometimes misunderstood the fragile web of European relations. Naval expansion and colonial competition illustrated a desire to be recognized among the great powers, but they also created tensions that would later contribute to conflict. The interplay between status-seeking and strategic miscalculation is a recurring theme in the era's international relations. When war finally enveloped Europe in 1914, the empire's institutions were tested in ways they had never been before. The initial surge of nationalist fervor and the call to arms produced scenes of departure and solidarity, but the war quickly became a grinding contest of attrition that strained resources and civic morale. The initial confidence that marches and banners seemed to promise gave way to rationing, sorrow, and weary calculation. The human cost of the war reshaped families and communities, leaving scars that would be felt for generations. The collapse of the empire in 1918 was both a political earthquake and a moral reckoning. Soldiers returned to shattered economies and disrupted social orders, and the abdication of the Kaiser signaled the end of an era of princely rule. In the vacuum, new political experiments and extremist movements jostled for influence, and the Weimar Republic was born into a landscape of unmet expectations and acute trauma. Transition meant confrontation with change, and the memories of imperial glory and wartime sacrifice remained potent forces in the new republic's politics. Memory of the empire after its fall was contested and complex. Veterans, monarchists, republicans, and radicals each framed the past to serve different futures. Narrative contests about responsibility and honor played out in newspapers, memorial ceremonies, and political rhetoric. Monuments and rituals that had once expressed imperial unity were reinterpreted or dismantled, and new commemorative practices tried to make sense of defeat and loss. The past became a canvas onto which a wounded society projected hopes, grievances, and attempts at reconciliation. The interwar years were a time of both reflection and forgetting, as societies tried to restore normalcy while grappling with modern crises. Economies were volatile, and political extremists exploited anxieties in pursuit of transformative agendas. Cultural production was vigorous and often ambivalent about modernity, reflecting both a fascination with innovation and a nostalgia for perceived pre-war certainties. The legacy of the empire was an undercurrent in these debates, sometimes evoked as a source of pride and sometimes blamed for the calamities that had followed. When the Nazi regime later seized power, it appropriated elements of imperial symbolism even as it radically transformed the state. The militarism, hierarchical structures, and certain national myths of the imperial past were remade into something more sinister and catastrophic. It is essential to distinguish continuity from complicity. Many institutions and cultural forms had long histories that were co-opted by a regime that committed monstrous crimes. Understanding these continuities without flattening them into deterministic explanations is key to a responsible engagement with history. After the Second World War, Germany's landscape of memory underwent another seismic shift as occupation, division, and the revelation of genocide demanded new forms of accounting. In the West, rebuilding included an effort to create a democracy that could prevent the return of authoritarianism. In the East, communist regimes deployed different narratives, emphasizing anti-fascism and class struggle. Both German states confronted the imperial past unevenly, sometimes confronting and sometimes evading difficult questions about responsibility and memory. The politics of remembrance in post-war Germany became a moral and civic project that involved education, law, and public commemoration. Museums, memorials, and legal frameworks sought to document atrocities and educate future generations. The process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally, coming to terms with the past, was contested, painful, and ongoing. This process could not and did not replace the need for personal and communal mourning, but it did establish a template for Republican and democratic responsibility. In the architecture of Berlin and other cities, traces of the empire persisted in buildings that had survived wars and reconstructions. Palaces, stations, and museums anchored cityscapes in deeper histories, while new constructions sometimes masked or replaced older forms. The way cities remembered, or chose not to remember, played out in debates about preservation, about whose monuments remained and which names stayed on street signs. Urban space, in this way, became a public archive of competing memories. Education about the imperial period evolved over decades, shifting from nationalist celebration to critical analysis. School curricula, once heavy with patriotic narratives, gradually incorporated scholarship that examined social injustice, colonial violence, and the complex forces that led Europe to catastrophe. Teachers and historians played a central role in reshaping how young citizens understood the past, choosing to emphasize plurality, critical thinking, and ethical engagement. Memory, here, became pedagogical work. Reunification in 1990 brought new attention to the empire's legacy, as West and East Germans negotiated a common narrative of the past while accounting for divergent experiences under different regimes. The reunified state had to reconcile different commemorative cultures, legal systems, and social memories. These challenges were not only political but deeply personal, as families and communities integrated stories of loss, separation, and resilience. Reunification reopened conversations about national identity, about the threads that stitch a society together after decades of separation. Contemporary debates about monuments, street names, and historical memory often return to questions that were first raised under the empire: who is honored in public space, and what stories do we tell about the nation? Statues of statesmen and generals, the names of avenues, and plaques on buildings become flashpoints for broader questions about inclusion and historical truth. Decisions to remove or contextualize monuments are rarely simple. They involve weighing the value of historical memory against the harms memorialization can perpetuate. These debates reveal how the past remains alive in the civic life of today. The legacy of colonialism has received increasing attention in recent years, as activists and scholars have pressed for reparations, restitutions, and honest reckoning. Objects looted or taken under duress now sit in museums far from their origins, and conversations about returning these items are part of a larger effort to address historical injustice. A society that values historical truth confronts these issues not with excuses but with humility and concrete measures. Engaging with colonial legacies thus becomes a moral test of the Republic's commitment to justice. Technology and cultural consumption shape how modern Germans experience the imperial past. Documentaries, podcasts, exhibitions, and digital archives make archives accessible in ways impossible in earlier generations. This new media environment enables broader public participation in historical debates, allowing descendants, scholars, and concerned citizens to collaborate on telling more inclusive stories. With access comes responsibility. The ease of dissemination must be matched by rigorous scholarship and ethical reflection. National identity in modern Germany is, in many ways, a product of negotiation between memory and aspiration, between regional traditions and a cosmopolitan present. The emperor's shadow persists in ceremonies, in legal forms, and in architecture, but it coexists with an open, pluralistic society that claims European integration and global engagement as central commitments. Germany today is a country of immigrants, newcomers, and rooted communities, and this demographic complexity inflects how the past is remembered and taught. Artistic expressions continue to grapple with the imperial past, pulling on threads that stretch from 19th-century salons to contemporary galleries. Writers, filmmakers, and visual artists revisit imperial themes, exposing forgotten stories and reimagining narratives that center marginalized voices. By doing so, they not only resurrect history but interrogate the assumptions that once legitimated power. The arts thus serve as both mirror and hammer, reflecting and reshaping public consciousness about memory and identity. Legal institutions in modern Germany stand as a testament to the continuity of certain administrative practices and the evolution of others. Constitutional law, civil service organization, and federal structures have roots that reach back into imperial frameworks, but they have been transformed by democratic principles, human rights norms, and international obligations. Law is a living archive of compromise and reform, and it documents the ways a society learns from its past and attempts to prevent repetition of previous atrocities. Conversations about reparations and responsibility reach into the present in practical and symbolic ways. They demand examination of archives, restitution of stolen items, apologies, and sometimes financial compensation. These steps are not merely gestures, they are part of a process that acknowledges harm and seeks restitution. In confronting imperial legacies, contemporary Germany demonstrates that memory work is not only reflective but also operative, guiding policy and diplomacy. The role of the historian in this landscape is both scholarly and civic. Historians attempt to sift through complex archives, to differentiate evidence from myth, and to narrate the past in ways that illuminate the present. Their work often finds audiences beyond academia in museums, schools, and public debates, and they play a vital role in keeping the past from becoming a weaponized tool of simplification. History, when practiced ethically, fosters nuance and informs democratic deliberation. Commemoration practices have grown more inclusive over time, attempting to honor a fuller range of experiences: soldiers and civilians, colonizers and colonized, rulers and the ruled. Memorials have become more diverse in form and less presumptive in meaning, designed to invite reflection rather than to dictate interpretation. This openness reflects a public willingness to accept complexity and to resist tidy narratives that gloss over injustice. Remembrance thus becomes an act of civic humility and a commitment to a more truthful communal story. The German Empire's material culture, railway stations, palaces, industrial ruins, provides tangible links to a past that can be toured, studied, and debated. Industrial archaeology, for example, turns former factories into museums and cultural spaces, allowing visitors to stand amid machines that once dictated rhythm and labor. These places not only preserve artifacts but also create contexts for interpreting the human stories entwined with them. They remind us that history is embodied as much as it is written. Commemorative rituals evolve as society's ethical standards change. What once might have been a triumphal procession can be reimagined as a sober remembrance of cost and consequence. The transformation of such rituals is evidence that society can learn to mourn differently, to honor without glorifying, and to teach younger generations the difference between heroism and hubris. These shifts reveal a maturing civic culture that values critical memory over uncritical celebration. The interplay between national memory and European integration is another dimension of the empire's legacy. As Germany became a central actor in the European project, it also had to reconcile national myths with transnational responsibilities. The European Union offered a framework in which memory could be shared, contested, and sometimes harmonized, creating a space where past antagonisms could be mediated through law, trade, and cultural exchange. European integration thus serves as both a balm and a challenge for national narratives. Public discourse about the empire often hinges on language, terms that evoke honor, shame, progress, or repression. How politicians and educators choose words can frame the past as tragedy, as apology, or as inexorable progress. Language shapes public consciousness, and debates over vocabulary reflect deeper struggles about accountability and identity. Choosing how to speak about the past is therefore an act of moral and political significance. The archive itself is a contested terrain, where records of power coexist with fragments of ordinary life. Diaries, municipal records, business ledgers, and letters provide insight into daily routines, while official papers often reveal the calculations of statecraft. Opening archives and making them accessible is an act of democratization. It allows more voices to participate in shaping the narrative. Transparency about the record helps prevent the past from being monopolized by a narrow set of interests. Memory education has become more sophisticated, moving beyond rote memorization to cultivate critical thinking and ethical reflection. Teaching about the empire now often includes voices of subaltern groups, the colonized, and dissenters whose stories complicate national myths. Pedagogy increasingly emphasizes primary sources, empathy, and the skills to evaluate competing claims. This educational turn aims not at erasing pride in one's country but at fostering citizens who can confront uncomfortable truths honestly. Monuments that were once unchallenged can become sites of protest and reinterpretation, revealing how public space is always politically charged. Debates over whether to remove, relocate, or recontextualize statues engage communities in deliberation about what values deserve public honor. When societies choose context over erasure, setting statues in museums with explanatory plaques, for example, they create opportunities for collective learning rather than simply to expel difficult memories. Such choices demonstrate a commitment to complexity and to the educational potential of public art. The relationship between memory and identity is never static, it is always being negotiated across generations. Grandparents remember with a certain texture that younger people might not feel, and as demographics change, so do perspectives on the past. New migrant communities bring other histories and memories into the national conversation, further complicating what it means to be German. Far from diluting memory, such pluralism enriches it, producing a more layered and resilient public identity. Urban renewal projects often collide with historical preservation, forcing cities to choose between economic modernization and commemorative continuity. Redevelopment can erase physical traces of the imperial past, while preservation can inhibit necessary growth. The challenge is to find balance, protecting critical sites of memory while allowing living cities to evolve. Thoughtful urban planning treats heritage not as an anchor that hinders motion but as a resource that can be integrated into contemporary life. The legal reckoning with the past extends beyond museums and classrooms into the courts, where restitution cases and investigations into historical wrongs unfold. Legal processes can correct injustices, but they can also be hampered by the limits of evidence, statute, and political will. The law is a blunt instrument for complex moral claims, yet it remains essential in translating memory into tangible redress. Legal outcomes, even imperfect, signal a commitment to accountability and historical justice. Contemporary cultural initiatives, festivals, exhibitions, theater productions, continue to interpret the imperial legacy in ways that invite public engagement rather than passive reception. These events can bring history to life, making it feel immediate and relevant rather than remote and dusty. By staging encounters with the past, culture connects memory to present concerns, migration, inequality, global responsibility, and the ethics of commemoration. Such initiatives demonstrate how history can be an active participant in civic life. The German Empire's influence on law, language, and social institutions is evident in subtle ways. The structure of civil service, the vocabulary of administration, and expectations about social insurance all bear traces of the period. Yet these elements have been reshaped by democratic principles, by human rights law, and by transnational norms that regulate everything from labor to environmental standards. The past is present, but it is also subject to reinterpretation and reform as societies evolve and as new values take root. Finally, the act of remembering the German Empire is an ongoing conversation, not a closed book. Citizens, scholars, artists, and politicians continue to engage with the past through research, debate, and creative expression. Memory is not a single story but a chorus of voices that include pride and regret, achievement and atrocity, innovation and injustice. Listening to that chorus with care and responding with honesty and humility is essential to understanding how the echoes of an empire shaped the making of modern Germany and how that shaping continues to unfold. The story of the German Empire is still being written by everyone who remembers it. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what speaks to you more, the pride of what was built or the lessons learned from what was lost.